All right. Good evening, everybody. This is the October 30th, 2019 hearing of the Baltimore City Council's Health Committee. I am Councilman Christopher Burnett, Chairman of the committee. Also in attendance, President Brandon Scott, Bill Henry, member of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Clark, member of the committee. Councilmember Reisinger, member of the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Slifer, member of the committee. I don't see anyone else from the council here yet. We've also been joined by Kaylin Young of the council president's office, Rebecca Simmons of the president's office, and to my immediate right is Margaret Curran, the committee staff person for the health committee. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight. And I'm just going to start with just sort of a purpose statement to ground us on the intent of this hearing and some housekeeping and logistical overviews of how things are going to go this evening. At the start of the hearing today, we mourn the loss of 283 people who've been lost to violence in Baltimore City and countless more who've been harmed by non-fatal gun wounds. This issue is not a new one in Baltimore. We've struggled with this issue for decades. Unfortunately, these facts are not surprising to anyone in Baltimore, as the disease of gun violence has been an issue for a very long time. However, the time to change is now. As we continue to experience violence across our city, it is critical that we take an all-hands-on-deck approach to making our neighborhoods safer for all of us and treat gun violence as a public health crisis that can only be solved holistically and through partnership with community and government working together. The intention of this hearing today is to shine a spotlight on the work being done to end gun violence by community-based organizations, large and small institutions, community leaders, and government agencies, and work to build a comprehensive public health-centered violence reduction agenda for Baltimore. And tonight is the first step in that goal. We will not figure this all out tonight, but my hope is that by having a solutions-focused, honest conversation about where we stand today, we can begin to work collectively to end gun violence in Baltimore. The hearing will flow a little bit formally, but we will have testimony from the public. But we're going to have a series of panels representing a number of different perspectives. So we have academic researchers here that will provide some big picture context as to what the challenges are with ending gun violence. We'll have some report outs from all of the government agencies working on ending gun violence in Baltimore City, and we have speakers who are doing work on the ground every day in the community and want to highlight the work that they're doing to solve this challenge as well. Before I go any further, I do want to offer the council president an opportunity to say a few words on this topic as the former chair of the Public Safety Committee and a longtime advocate for ending violence in Baltimore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, everyone. Mr. Chair, let me first start by thanking you for taking this leadership role. You know that in this chamber, it's the very first place that we said that Baltimore should have to recognize that gun violence is a disease and we have to attack it from a public health and a holistic standpoint. This is the only way that we're going to solve and cure our city of this disease. It's not going to happen by one agency or one approach. We're going to have a multifaceted approach, top to bottom, thinking about how we can truly root this disease out of our city. So, Mr. Chair, I thank you for your leadership and your continued leadership on this issue. Carrying the baton down the line and making sure that we are now starting to push the envelope, and again, making sure that Baltimore understands that we are ridden with a disease, and the only way to do that is to cure it, and we have to cure it by all working together across boundary lines, across government, across nonprofit and the business sector. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also note we've been joined by Matt Stegman from the mayor's office. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to call up the first two speakers. And again, I want to note we'll have planned speakers. I will ask the committee to hold your questions until the end of each panel, to just in the interest of time. And we're asking the speakers to keep the comments concise, because we do have a lot of people here that want to get the word out on what they're doing. And I know that there are individuals who may want to testify. If you haven't signed up to testify, there's a form in the back. And just check the box letting us know. And once we've done all of the panels, then we'll go to public testimony. All right. So the first two speakers up, we have Dr. Joseph Richardson, University of Maryland and Capital Region Violence Intervention Program. I'm sorry, hold on 1 second. I read it wrong. We're gonna actually start with, my apologies, sir. We're gonna start with Antonio Moore. He's a youth advocate. There we go. Give it up for him, give it up for him.
Thank you, Chair. First off, I want to start off I want to dedicate this testimony to countless of young people in my neighborhood and friends that have lost to gun violence. Cedric Peterson, Milton Carrington, Antonio Skipwith, and I carry these names with me every day because these are the fallen soldiers that I do this work for. So I want to start off, I want to share a short video clip with you all, and I want you all to listen very close. Now, this is not clips from a third world country or a war movie scene. This is actually 10 minutes away in East Baltimore City. I want to share another clip with you all, and this is a storytelling of a young person in a middle school that I've worked very closely with and grew very fond of.
Don't at the door. Hitting everybody was right there, hit the guy, the lady, and the baby fell. And I was in the house now, scared out of my mind. It was like,
This has become the reality for our young people in Baltimore City over the past decade. And in 2019, these incidents seem to get worse and worse. We living in the city where our neighborhoods feel like war zones. There was a survey that came out that said 38% of children don't even feel safe walking home in Baltimore City, but I believe that number is a lie. Is that countless incidents of violence that held our community hostage for over decades. I've spoken to the 2020 presidential candidates earlier this year. I've spoken to the United States Surgeon General, and I was surprised to hear the disconnect between national policy and national decision makers in inner city, marginalized communities like Baltimore City. But when I come to Baltimore and I come to events like this and I testify at committees like this, I feel like somewhat I'm preaching to the choir because everybody seems to know what the problem is. But when this is the reality for our young people in 2019, some of these incidents as fresh as 2 days ago when 9 people were shot up in Park Heights, 15 people were shot in the weekend just a couple weeks ago, I start to wonder, am I really preaching to the choir? Mama always told me 2 things about people. If something don't change, one, they don't know, or they don't care. So the work we all are doing, we have to come out of our silos and be real about really taking what it's going to take to really end this issue. I think the city for a long time has largely ignored community people that have been working in their communities for so long without the resources and that have the knowledge and that have the access to the very young people you all claim to serve. There are countless of community organizations that are preventing real wars and that carry these stories and are holding communities together by a tiny thread that receive the very minimal support from the city government. If we're going to be real about this issue, we can't leave it up to lawmakers and the police to really solve this issue for us, because it's going to take all of us. But the community must be empowered enough and have the resources enough and have access to be able to carry out this great work, what we know to be. So I ask that you all today, when you hear these testimonies, when you all speak on your panels, that we be real about the reason why we here. I don't want to have to come testify at another hearing. I don't want to be called to another board meeting. Gun violence has just been a reality of me since I was younger. And at first, I became so normalized to it that I just thought it just was a way of life. But when I traveled outside of Baltimore City and I seen the way real people live and know what it's like to be safe in their own neighborhoods, I began to wonder, what the hell are we doing in our city? The community and the youth have the answers, and it's about time the adults and city government is for real and say, yo, we don't have the answers. We really need our young people at the table. We really need to bring the community tight at the table. And we got to stop this work in silos. It's so much great work going on around the city that if we all come together, I'm sure we can have a much greater impact. But there are connections that I think the city has to make. And I'm sure that the health department and the mayor's office can house some of this great work under some of the offices and bring together and really provide these people with the resources they need to continue and further this work. The community is not off the hook as well. The only time you tell, because we know what it is with snitching in our community, the only time we tell is when we catch wind of somebody we know about to do something stupid, you tell them not to do it. That's the only time you tell. So the community, we have to come together, and if enough is really enough, we have to be real about holding each other accountable as a community. And city government, don't just sit in your offices and behind your desks and hear these stories and pretend to care. You guys have to make the necessary legislative changes needed for us to really see an end to this issue. Because if we don't have anything on policy or anything in the government, we can have all the community work done we want. We still gonna be playing from behind. This is a city that the current conditions of these shootings have been created by way of large city government policy. We have to be real about how we're going to use law to actually not lock up people and bring tighter restrictions on guns, because we see that the guns that have been committed in these crimes are not illegal. We have to be real about creating legislative policy that create better conditions for our young people so we aren't living in a constant militant state, and that people feel a sense of ownership and a social ownership for the city and neighborhoods that we live in. Let's get these communities developed. Let's get these damn schools properly funded, because I realize that the bill coming up to the Maryland State, whoever it is up in Maryland State, is coming at the same time as this Kerwin bill and this education bill is coming in. And oftentimes, the city and the state's budget is always balanced on the backs of our young people and on the backs of our senior citizens. The question is whether or not you'll invest in young people. The question is whether it'll be on the front end or the back end. And Baltimore City has showed me that answer. And these consequences have showed what back end investment looks like. Why does the city police have the biggest amount of dollar funding in the budget and we can't allocate the proper money for our schools? I'm inside 3 different middle schools every day where the kids have a lot of behavioral problems and unaddressed trauma. There's one social worker. There's one. And the tiles is missing from the ceiling. Some of these kids can't even drink from the very fountains that sit in their schools because there's lead water still contained in them. We have blocks and blocks and blocks of vacant houses that are undeveloped and that people are holding on for tax benefits, but contribute to the very conditions that create this type of violent crime in our neighborhoods. We have people that can come in the city, big businesses that can operate and make a killing off the city. We got some of the biggest Fortune 1000 companies in Baltimore City, but there aren't many employment opportunities specifically directed to our young people. If we're going to be serious about restoring the village in Baltimore City, because we do need to get the village back, we have to begin to make the proper investments and decisions and hold our businesses and our communities accountable for each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have Willem Killebrew, Director of Office of Youth and Trauma Services from the Health Department, and I believe he has a PowerPoint. Is that up already? Okay. And we've been joined by Councilmember Zeke Cohen, 1st District.
Good evening, Chairman Burnett and Vice Chair Henry, and to the Committee on Health and to President Scott. My name is William Kellebrew, and I am the Director for the Office of Youth and Trauma Services at the Baltimore City Health Department. I am representing our Health Commissioner, Dr. Letitia Gerasa. This evening, Dr. Gerasa is continuing her listening tour around the city at the Y of Central Maryland in Waverly. As our new health commissioner, she is using what she is learning in the community, and this is her fifth listening session community conversation, to inform the department's strategic planning process, which is well underway as we speak. She has asked me to speak with you this evening regarding gun violence as a public health crisis and BCHD's work to address the cycle of trauma and violence. Next slide. Violence in Baltimore City is an epidemic, as you've heard. It is a learned behavior that in many ways behaves like a disease. Violence causes trauma, and trauma causes violence. Dr. Kathy Whittam coins the term intergenerational transmission of violence. In Baltimore City, firearm homicide is the leading cause of death for residents under 25 years of age. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 2017, 30% of firearm homicide victims were residents under 25 years of age in Baltimore City. Slide 3, please. Young people are often considered the problem when many of our youth have a history of trauma and experience of victimization. Our youth are facing adversity, as you've heard from Antonio, such as unemployment, homelessness, poverty, structural racism, and other barriers preventing them from experiencing upward mobility. From academic research on childhood experiences, current health status, and behaviors has emerged a framework for understanding the effects of trauma through the groundbreaking 1995 Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs, study. According to the CDC, the ACE study has documented how ACEs are strongly related to development of risk factors for disease and well-being throughout the lifespan. An ACE score was developed from 10 survey questions related to negative health and well-being outcomes. The higher the number of questions answered yes by participants, the higher the risk for negative outcomes. ACEs, next slide. ACEs have been directly linked to the likelihood of traumatic brain injury. Depression, suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, unintended pregnancy, and complications, even surrounding fetal deaths. HIV and sexually transmitted infections, cancer and diabetes, alcohol and substance use and misuse, smoking, and unfortunately, it is also linked to the likelihood of early death. Next slide. While the original ACE study surveyed mostly white college-educated middle upper-class participants, the Philadelphia ACEs project investigated if there would be different results of community-level stressors such as witnessing violence even, feeling discriminated against, experiencing harm or feeling unsafe in your own neighborhood, being bullied by a classmate or peer, and having experienced the foster care system, which are all not a part of the original ACEs. Next slide. According to Changing Minds Now, violence and trauma affects the brain, child development, and life expectancy. Experts say that the more a child witnesses violence and experiences trauma, the more that child's brain experiences fear, anxiety, and impulsiveness, leading to risky behavior. Research also shows that 7 to 10 individuals are directly impacted by a family member's homicide. Given Baltimore City's population and the homicide rate, there's a likelihood that everyone in this room either knows of someone who has been impacted by gun violence or has personally experienced a close loss. Homicide causes a ripple effect of hurt, grief, and even anger well after the incident or event has occurred. Healing is often described as a lifelong journey. Next slide. In Baltimore City, nearly 1/3 of children have 2 or more ACEs. These children are more likely to have adverse health outcomes compared to children with 0 ACEs. I should note, experts strongly recommend that the ACE screening should not be administered to children and youth Childhood experiences, both positive and negative, have tremendous impact on future violence victimization, as well as youth becoming responsible parties of violent crimes. ACEs impacts a child's lifelong health and opportunity to grow and thrive. During traumatic situations, adolescents make decisions about whether and how to intervene, and about using a gun or weapon to counter violence. Adolescent response to traumatic reminders can be reckless behavior that endangers themselves and others, or avoidant behavior that can derail their adolescent years, and consequences of these often show up in health outcomes as adults. However, ACEs should not be considered a death sentence. We can all heal through the development of healthy and supportive relationships. In honoring the memory and legacy of one of Baltimore's and the United States heroes, the Honorable Congressman Elijah Cummings, he continuously said, quote, "Our children are the messengers we send to the future, a future we will never get to see," end quote. Children are our most vulnerable, but our most precious resource. And as an aside, I had the opportunity to testify before the House Oversight and Reform Committee in the U.S. Congress this summer on trauma, the first ever historically held congressional hearing on trauma in over 200 years. His leadership and advocacy will be dearly missed. Like other forms of youth violence, gun violence requires a comprehensive approach that influences all levels of the social ecology or environment in which we live. It involves community involvement, relationships among families and neighbors, and individual behaviors. Effective prevention strategies focus on modifying our policies, practices, and societal norms to create safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments. Essentially, a public health approach is about heading upstream, focused on prevention. And as Antonio said today, how do we look at the front end and do something on the front end? While we need both front end and back end, because we also have to mitigate circumstances that happen, it's important that we focus on going upstream. A trauma-informed approach or trauma-informed care is synonymous with prevention and a strengths-based approach. According to the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, a trauma-informed approach focuses on 4 R's. A public health approach begins with realizing the prevalence of violence and trauma impacting children, youth, families, and communities. We then need to recognize the role that trauma plays in the lives of the individuals that we serve in our programs, by our systems, and then respond by putting our knowledge into practice. And the 4th R is about resisting re-traumatization. When an individual feels unsafe while accessing services, this may be triggering or a traumatic reminder of a past traumatic experience. Next slide. The Health Department's Office of Youth and Trauma Services, in collaboration with city agencies, community-based partners, residents, and participants, work to ensure that individuals impacted by trauma receive culturally sensitive services. And as I mentioned before, we offer training and technical assistance to agencies and organizations on an organizational trauma-informed approach. Supporting our students is another program located in Sandtown, Winchester neighborhood that focuses on school-based violence prevention by addressing risk and protective factors at the high school levels. In collaborations with Safe Streets through a violence interruption model, SOS works with violence interrupters or community implementers or school implementers as well within and beyond the school walls to assist with conflict mediation and healthy relationship building and modeling. We are currently implementing this program in 4 schools. In 2015, the Health Department was one of several cities that were funded by SAMHSA following civil unrest. The grant award focused on the 21217 area code. The Baltimore City Intergenerational Initiative for Trauma in Youth was born out of the RECAST grant, Resilience in Communities After Stress and Trauma. This is a community-led meeting focused on organizational and collaborative results of grantee activities. We have had many agencies, experts, and community members stop by to share information, city planning, and resources. This program is entering its 4th year with a multitude of committed partners and grantees. The Office of Youth Services and Advocacy Project, which we have members today here, is supported by the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention through the Victims of Crime Act at FOCA Administrator, and is in its 3rd year of funding for citywide implementation. This program serves primary and secondary victims of violence between the ages of 11 and 24. Including human trafficking or sexually exploited individuals, bullying victims, domestic violence, sexual assault, and multiple forms of crimes and victimization committed against youth. Supporting Male Survivors of Violence is another program funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime, and Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and is in its analysis stage in the evaluation process, which is conducted in partnership with the University of Maryland School of Social Work. This program serves youth from ages 14 to 24 who were either exposed to violence and/or experienced victimization. The analysis will inform our pathway forward in understanding the needs of young males of color and their families and how we can address gaps in services. Lastly, the Family Resilience Project is nearing its second year and, if funded, will continue to work around the intersection of the opioid crisis and unintended victims of the opioid epidemic. These young people are between the ages of 11 and 24. Next slide. The Health Department supports a multi-sector, multidisciplinary approach to address violence and trauma. We have a wealth of partners in each program and project dedicated to serving Baltimore's residents. This is the epitome of public health approach where city agencies, organizations, residents, and the public come together to focus on results that support overall health of residents living, working, and playing in Baltimore. These agencies and community-based organizations are responsible for providing resources, referrals, and supports to victims and survivors of trauma and violence. This is an effective public health approach that takes us upstream to address the underlying causes of violence. And I just want to take a point of personal privilege because this is a very moving evening based on Antonio's testimony getting us started. Antonio, you really set the tone tonight. And I'm glad he led that as a young person tonight and really put forth his story and the impact that violence and trauma has had on him and his family. And I also mentioned that I actually witnessed the murders of my family at the age of 10 in our family living room. And so it's important that our public servants who work every single day in the government, our community members, that we understand this is a multifaceted approach. And we have the staff on hand and the will and determination to do something about it. And I wanted to leave on that positive note. And thank you for the opportunity to present tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from the committee for either of our first two speakers? Okay. So I did have one for Mr. Moore. If you could come back up, young brother. Okay. So one, I wanted to thank you for opening up and definitely setting the tone for us. I want to take a page out of my colleague Councilman Cohen's book and always try to open these hearings with a youth voice because, as you stated, that we have to elevate those voices. And if we're going to really be serious about solving this issue in Baltimore and many others. So thank you for doing that for us. You mentioned the need for young people to have a real seat at the table. What does that look like to you?
So what we have to realize is young people, let's be clear about this. The majority of these shootings and homicides are being committed by young people, right? Now, us being young people in the city, we understand with information, there's a fine line we walk with city government and the police department and different other entities because of the same circumstances that surround where we live. But we know what works, and we have the accessibility to a lot of these people who are at high risk to commit crimes. So, for example, I mentor a lot of young people in my neighborhood, McElderry Park. McElderry Park was the neighborhood that Safe Streets was first piloted in because of the high volume of young people committing violence. Some of these young people, there have been days where I wanted to go get them out the corner. They didn't come up to the community center. But where could I take them? Before I, fortunately enough, could partner up with Uncle T, where he had this model around restorative justice, conflict resolution, manhood development, and a safe place for young people to come, especially high-risk young people, because let's get this clear. Youth engagement for trauma-informed and high-risk youth looks a lot different than your average child. And unfortunately, our young people are growing up very fast in this city. So I think we began to get unculturally responsive as far as, all right, if we ask young people to be at the table, what type of funding are we giving projects for young people? I think that's yet to be addressed. Youth Art Resources, Baltimore Community Foundation, they've done a great job of providing opportunities for youth grants. But let's be clear about some of this work. some of this work ain't happening from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Some of this real work, like calling your homeboy up and letting them know, yo, I seen what happened on the news, and I know you know this. Let me come holler at you real quick. Or I need to come talk to you up close. But some young people have transportation barriers, right? Some young people, so a lot of these people that are in the streets, a lot of them, young people especially, are food insecure in the household. So sometimes I have to go out my way to take some of these young people, even to just go grab lunch and be like, yo, let's talk for a second. You know, I know this recently happened, and I know you are committing these behaviors in school, and I know you have the very means and access to a gun and the very means to carry out what you want to do. But just that critical time with young people from other young people stops a lot of these shootings of what's going on in the neighborhood. I can't say this. Since the summertime, August 29th, we lost, in 12 a.m., we lost somebody very dear to the community. That was 16-year-old Milton, and I'm glad his mother is here. A lot of his siblings, a lot of the kids that I mentor, and let me say this, these kids have not been offered not one bit of support, accessibility, or exposure opportunity for anything. But the media has always found their way around when the story gets hot. The media will track you down if you got a hot scandal in your hand. But there's no resources, no type of help or support coming from the very people and very reporters that will go into the hood to go get the story. But what does that follow-up and that support look like for those young people? We slaughtering our children right now. These children are carrying around trauma similar to some of these young people in war-torn countries like Afghanistan. And you can check the research. The numbers show it. But if anybody heard that video earlier, y'all know we wouldn't need research or somebody, a professor, to figure that out. So young people, we just not talking about having young people at the table, because I feel like that's a term that's being thrown around the city a lot right now. We have to be real about trusting the leadership and the ideas about supporting, and this is going to take some money. Let me tell you this, money make the world go round, and this is a conversation we are always scared to have. How does it really look to really put the ball in young people's hands and really put the funding behind some of these young people? Because let's be clear about this. A lot of these young people are doing amazing work without half the resources the police department or some of you politicians have. Why are you all still getting paid if the job you're doing, the very job you're being paid to do, is not being carried out? And I don't mean to be disrespectful at all, but if we have you and as an elected official or people that are trusted and took an oath to protect the community, why are we still seeing the same homicide statistics, and why do I have to continue to have candle lights and to have, I'm not even gonna lie to you, some of the stuff I say, man, I gotta get some help for, and that's just being real. But I stay strong because there's a community I know I help to hold together. And that's the same case for a lot of our young leaders across the city. So we definitely need more funding towards youth-led initiatives. We need to be real about how are we operating these community centers we have for our young people. Because the need is not from 9 to 5, like I said. We need extended hours at our recreation centers for young people. We definitely need them renovated. You know, how stuff look in Mount Vernon is a whole lot more than how it look in McElderry Park. I'll tell you that right now. So let's be real about, you know, not only providing young people with the money and the support to carry out great work, but also let's be real with ourselves. If you're not ready to work yourself out of a job or a role, then you're in it for the wrong reasons.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. Sorry, we were trying to figure out some of the logistics. Yeah, y'all can go ahead. You had a question for that? Okay. So, you got a question? Okay. Go ahead, Councilman Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, William, for your partnership. Appreciate your support with the Trauma Responsive Care Act. It's been interesting as we've put this bill out, just seeing the reaction from community has been really intense. A lot of folks have been interested, have wanted to have the work that, to Antonio's point, they're already doing reflected within the bill. One group that's kind of emerged through this has been barbers. We had an initial meeting a couple weeks ago with a couple of folks, barbers in East Baltimore and barbers in West Baltimore, and they spoke about how they see themselves as healers. And when folks go into the shop or go into the chair, they're often vulnerable. They're telling stories. They're engaging. There's a lot of healing happening. And then we had a meeting with some of the barbers yesterday, and it grew to about 30 different people. And it was primarily Spanish-speaking Dominican barbers from Southeast Baltimore. It was folks like Troy Stanton from West Baltimore. But part of what's sparked for me is I think that the sort of trauma-informed or healing work is happening in a lot of spaces that we aren't even imagining, that folks who are in these jobs in the health department, elected officials, don't always see. And so I'm curious what we as a health department can do to elevate some of the healing work that's happening in spaces where it's not being recognized. Because I think if Baltimore is going to heal, if we're going to have a truly trauma-informed or trauma-responsive approach, part of that is recognizing the work that's already happening, particularly to Antonio's point, the underfunded gut work that's happening in churches and barbershops and libraries. So how do you all think about incorporating sort of the community-based work that's happening already?
That's a question for the health department?
Yeah, that's a question for the health department.
You can use the mic at your desk.
Thank you, Councilmember Cohen. I think that's a really great question. I think that all of the information that Antonio's posed is it's right on point. I think we need to go upstream. I think the Trauma Responsive Bill to Care Act is a good start to that, and we are, as a health department, very happy to be a part of that effort in its current form, and we'll continue to support that. I think that it starts somewhere, and really it's about the 4 R's, as I mentioned before, realizing the prevalence. I think we got that under wraps. I mean, I think we know what the problem is, but recognizing our city agencies, recognizing that trauma, that this approach works, and the engagement with community members and the resources that flow from government to community can flow positively, compassionately, and without a lot of the barriers that happen as we speak. And so I think that the collaboration is a huge point to us, just coming together, which we have done in many of the programs that we have. MOCJ, we're working hand in glove to be able to address, but going upstream and focusing on collaboration right now and pulling it together is something that we're augmenting at this point. And I think that this trauma responsive bill is just the first step in really bringing it together. And I think you see the evidence of that. I think the fact that you're putting it here on the table every single day, it is a conversation. I see you around the city in every space talking about it, and others talking about it. There are plenty of trauma-informed, there's evidence that it works, in different countries, cities around the country, it's working. And we, I think, can take that ball and run with it. And I think that's exactly where we are. We have existing resources that can match that. And I think that we can augment that, but we've got to start.
All that to say, again, appreciate your support and your work, and that there are great resources, great healing resources already within our communities, and it's sort of how do we elevate and lift up that work through this partnership. Thank you. And thank you to the chairman. I think just recognizing gun violence as a public health issue is critical for Baltimore, and so thank you for this hearing and for all the hearings you're doing.
Thank you. I also want to note before we move to the next panel that the intention of this hearing isn't to just have all of the work being done thrown out here, but I've already seen a little bit of phone numbers exchanging, cards exchanging. The reason we convene all of you here is that we want to make sure that everybody knows what everyone else is doing, to be able to build relationships so that in the spirit of collaboration, because we cannot do this together in isolation, as Antonio already said, we have to work together. So, I'd hope that if there is something that you hear today that speaks to you or a relationship that you need to have, please don't be shy. Share information, meet out in the back, because we have to work collectively to solve this challenge. So with that, we're going to move to our first panel, and both of the speakers can come up and take a seat, and rock, paper, scissors, and who wants to go first. But we have Dr. Joseph Richardson from University of Maryland, actually one of my former professors, College Park, and Dr. Daniel Webster from Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, Center for Gun Policy and Research. You have a presentation? Okay.
So good evening, Chairman. Thank you for inviting me, and also the council as well as the health committee. I am Dr. Joseph Richardson. I am a professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, in criminology and in medical anthropology in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Anthropology, and as well as I'm a professor here at the University of Maryland School of Medicine in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health. The clip I'm going to show you, I want you to put this into context because the clip is from a film documentary that I'm filming now called Life After the Gunshot, which is based on 10 young black male survivors of gunshot wounds, but it's set in Washington, D.C., because initially the research that I was conducting focused on young men in Washington, D.C. that have been shot, but I don't think any of the things that they are saying would be counter to with the narrative that you would hear in Baltimore City. I would also just add as well that I'm the former director of the Capital Region Violence Intervention Program, which I started at the University of Maryland Prince George's Hospital Center, and these narratives are based on young men that were treated at Prince George's Hospital Center that were shot. And so now I'm working here in shock trauma with their violence intervention program, and so I just wanted to put that in context before I show it.
I got shot May the 27th, 2015. May the 27th by the police. They ain't had no police to say police on their vest or nothing like that, so when they came up, we ain't know who they was. Then I got shot again May the 13th, Mother's Day, 2018. Sitting on the block, chilling. Drive-by shooting compact, I get shot 10 times.
You got hit 10 times?
Yeah.
But 2 times up in the chest, 1 time right here. Came out my neck, hit me in my mouth, hit me in my leg, hit me in my ass. I'm still kicking.
Symptoms of traumatic stress that you would see a soldier that was in, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. That's happening, a mile or two away from the White House.
Right now, you still hear that? This is a war zone. Talking about Iraq, DC is a war zone.
So it was your 3rd time you were shot in your life. What was the other 2 times?
I was 17 and 18. 70% of the young men coming in the trauma unit that are injured are in the criminal justice system.
1 out of 3 black males in this country are likely to spend time behind bars. And when it comes to white males, it's 1 out of 25. 1 in 35 are under some form of correctional supervision. Recidivism rate is really high in the United States.
The teen unemployment rate for black teens is a whopping 88%.
And coming from DC, you're not thinking about a job. You're thinking about having something in your pocket right now.
You leave a physical prison and you go into a social prison where you can't get a job, you can't get a student loan, you can't rent an apartment. How are people supposed to start over?
So do you think that was a moment in your life when you knew that you really could accomplish anything?
All right, man.
You don't know the purpose yet.
I'm still looking for a job right now. Whatever's on your record is on your record.
So that film, you clap if you want. So the trailer for that film I could paint the picture in Baltimore as well, because many young men that I work with here in Baltimore City suffer from the same exact traumatic experiences of multiple gunshot wounds over courses of their lives. And I know there's been the discussion of adverse childhood experiences, which is very important, but we also, as was eloquently stated, need to frame that in the context that the current ACEs doesn't really capture the experiences of young African-American people that live within the inner cities of our country. One of the reasons why I showed the intersection of multiple gunshot wounds and incidents of trauma recidivism is the work that I've been doing at Shock Trauma here in Baltimore. I did a study with 191 black men, and this is what I found. At least 90% of them have been incarcerated for 6 months or more, which basically is the entire sample. So every single person that had come into that trauma unit that fell into the category of a black male between the ages of roughly 18 and 35 have been incarcerated. 60% of them have been hospitalized 2 or more times for an injury over the course of their lifetime. And so what role does the healthcare system and the criminal justice system, how do they intersect and impact the lives of young people? Well, one way is to clearly, as a young man stated in the last clip, is his record, because looking and trying to find a job once someone has a felony is a high hurdle to get over. There was a study done by Diva Pager, a sociologist who's now deceased, who found that in a study between black men and white men with the same, she used the same resume and did experiments by sending them both into jobs, that found that a white male with a felony record had more of a chance and likelihood of getting a call back for a job than a black male with no record at all. Which essentially said that being a black male casts someone as a felon. You only need to be black and male to be seen as a felon. And so the impact of having a felony record and the disenfranchisement that comes with it, the inability to get a Pell loan, the inability to get employment, the inability to get housing if you have a drug offense, all those things which relegate people to second-class citizenship, we don't include that in the discussion on gun violence. That has totally been ignored. The impact that mass incarceration and mass probation, by placing a number of young people in Baltimore City and across this country on papers, where they're placed on a box, they can violate at any minute, and there are 1,100 collateral consequences to having a felony, and at any given point during the week, you're asked to do 8 different things by your PO, which I don't think many people in this room could adhere to those rules, which would lead to them being violated. And so what does that mean when someone goes to look for a job, and after 1 or 2 times, they become discouraged because the prospects of looking for a job, because they've engaged in what we call workforce development, which leads to exactly what? Results in them going back to the street, getting a gun, and doing what they have to do to survive, which then leads to the cycle of them coming back to the trauma unit again. So we cannot talk about gun violence without including the impact of the criminal justice system and the collateral consequences it not only has for that individual, but also for the traumatic effects it has for the communities that have been impacted by it. Sandtown, Winchester, 3% of Maryland state prison population comes from that one neighborhood. 3%. So if you think about the traumatic effects of leaving incarceration after being locked up for 5 to 10 years, and the trauma associated with incarceration, and then coming into a trauma unit, shot, you're patched up and discharged within anywhere between 24 and 72 hours and sent back to that same community. So I do wholeheartedly agree that we need to pay attention and invest in trauma-informed care for the entire city. But we also need to think about other creative ways we can address youth. I know there's a serious discussion and debate in Baltimore City about squeegee kids. And I just had this discussion earlier this morning that someone was telling me, you know, a young kid gets up at 7 in the morning to go out on the corner with his squeegee and his bottle of water in order to make a living and to make money. But why isn't he at school at that time? I agree that someone 14 years old should be in school at that time. But also, why are we not giving that child the opportunity to be an entrepreneur? Because clearly someone that's getting up at 7 in the morning to go out to make money has an entrepreneurial spirit. And getting out of the box of this workforce development, which we continuously rehash over and over, which ultimately may lead to a dead-end job if it doesn't lead to a job at all. We need to think of more creative ways of how we can address our youth and teaching them trauma-informed care and allowing them to do peer-to-peer trauma-informed care with their peers, because they're often are the ones who are going to hear the traumatic experiences before most of us adults will hear them. And so again, I urge you, the over-policing, the stop and frisk, which clearly was under consent decree by the U.S. Department of Justice, and the mass incarceration of young black men in Baltimore City and within this country has ultimately led to the gun violence crisis in many ways that we're seeing right now. And unless we take it and to look at this approach in layers, and that it's very complex, because there's just not issues of having a gun and possessing a gun and using it, which many use to be defensive and not offensive, that hospital violence intervention programs and programs like Cure Violence, yes, we can do the work, but we often do not have the bandwidth to address everyone. We need to take the highest of the high-risk people in order to be effective. And so the last thing I would say is, I was on a call today at 2 o'clock with, and I'm on the advisory board for the Violence Intervention and Prevention Program for the state of Maryland. I've been appointed by Governor Hogan. And our discussion on that call was the budget that was allotted for violence intervention and prevention programs 2 years ago, which my program applied for, as well as shock trauma here. The funding now has been reduced from a $5 million budget to $1.5 million. And now we have to think of creative ways to go back to Governor Hogan to think about how can we address that. And so lastly, you know, we have a number of professors in this room and young people, but I would also say that, you know, there have been cities that have taken very progressive steps because the CDC is not funding gun violence research, that should actually be part of a city's budget. If you really want to know about what gun violence is, I would not rely on the NIH and the CDC to address it. The council often has to have the political will to create ways that researchers and people that are advocates can get into the communities and really understand the problems that are experiencing on the ground. So we're able to do creative things like create a documentary to address these things. So I thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Webster.
Good evening. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this really important issue of gun violence and what public health brings to this. This is really powerful just to be in this room, frankly, with so many people committed to addressing this problem that have so many talents to bring to it with the type of passion and intellect of Antonio, Dr. Richardson's long-standing commitment. It's really quite inspiring. So I've been working on this issue for almost 30 years now, based at Johns Hopkins in the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And I'm going to make some specific points, but part of what I want to do here, because I know who's following me, I know there's a lot of expertise to follow, and I don't want to be redundant. But I want to give it a sort of an appreciation for what it even means to think about gun violence as a public health problem and what public health brings to this problem. Because frankly, a lot of people really don't understand public health so much, to be honest. Many of our health problems, including violence, are driven by structural conditions that are connected to public policies. And as we think about this as a public health problem, we need to be mindful of that. Be mindful of what are the public policies that create the set of conditions in Sandtown and Westchester with such high rates of incarceration and high rates of violence, for example. What are the housing issues? What are the transportation issues? There's so many issues that trap individuals in those communities in under-resourced and few opportunities. And it's easiest to think about violence in the most direct sense. It's a behavior, as was described. But it's a behavior in a context, okay? It's in a context of what are those set of opportunities and conditions that people are behaving, right? And because of our approach to this that involved high levels of arrest and incarceration, those opportunities are constrained. And people do incredibly risky things. Young people, as well as old people, do incredibly risky things because, as Antonio underscored, of food insecurity, eviction. Those sorts of things are really fundamental to actually addressing violence, because those are the things that actually drive the incredibly risky behavior that too many people are engaged in. So I think it is helpful to think about public health from a systems level. And we, of course, have a medical system and healthcare system. And the program of shock trauma has proven that it can and does reduce gun violence. And I'm happy that more hospitals in our cities are trying to do similar things to support perhaps the highest risk set of individuals that in our city, those who get shot. But there's also, one important thing statement I want to make is, too often I see people who want to embrace the public health dimension to this say, in essence, it's whatever is not policing or criminal justice. And in my view, there are a set of systems that create our violence, and that includes what's going on with policing and criminal justice. So we need to be partners with law enforcement and communities so that we get the kind of law enforcement we desperately need to keep us safe. Thomas Abt is going to talk to you soon. He's from Harvard. It's hard for a guy from Hopkins to sort of be deferential to a guy from Harvard, but because he's my friend and respected colleague, I'm going to let him kind of hit the home run with some of the evidence and principles here that really show what it takes to effectively reduce violence. He'll talk to you about issues of appropriate focus, balance in the approach, and fairness in that. And that is, all of those things are quintessential public health principles to addressing problems like violence. Baltimore has done a lot of good things in the spirit of public health, reducing violence. I've been honored to evaluate Safe Streets. We've had some success stories to report and remarkable things getting done with that program. But we've also learned its limitations. It's been under-resourced for a very long time. And we've honestly expected them to perform miracles in some cases. I'm happy that there is more investment in the program now. I'm happy that there are complementary programs like ROCA that we're going to hear from JT Timpson about. Those are desperately needed to make this program maximally effective. And the cities that are having the greatest impact with that kind of approach of street outreach, conflict resolution, really are investing in those high-risk individuals to help them change their lives, to give them the kind of opportunities that they haven't had and set of supports. And we have not committed ourselves to doing that yet. We have hoisted it upon street workers to try to figure this out without actually giving them those supports. There's some new data, exciting data for the ceasefire movement, showing that indeed it is changing minds, it is changing behaviors and contributing to community safety. That is really encouraging. So there's a lot of helpful signs here, but I think Baltimore, to sort of bring us to the next level, we really have to fully commit, and I so appreciate Antonio's comments about needing to work together rather than in silos, and that is my observation of being in the city, working on this issue for a very long time. A lot of good people, a lot of very committed to this program, not always working in concert. One rather holistic program that very recently that Baltimore is engaged in, the Violence Reduction Initiative. I actually been evaluating that. I haven't released any data, but the data are actually pretty impressive. About at least 5 out of the 7 areas have had significant reductions in gun violence, more so than what we would projected based upon other communities. But again, it sort of wasn't, in my opinion, not fully enough, not enough community engaged and led and participatory. So I feel like there's a lot of exciting opportunities to build on in Baltimore City to really fully embrace this public health perspective and orientation to this gun violence. And I think a lot of people in the room will be part of that solution. So I'm happy to be part of that.
Thank you. Questions from the committee?
Is that the, yeah, I do.
Councilwoman Clark?
Can I ask it to you, Dr. Webster? The very last thing you mentioned.
Yes.
Was the VRI.
Yes.
Right. And I think it's a great program.
Mm-hmm.
I don't happen to have one in most of my district,
Mm-hmm.
but I've been involved with it a little. And I was wondering, I mean, I have a theory about why it might be showing success, but I wonder if you do. I'm not asking you to make it official or anything, but what is it about that program and that effort that you think may prove out to be successful in reducing violence? Or is he already perhaps 5 out of 7 showing VRI areas that have lower violence than would be expected?
So that's a great and a fair question, and I won't be able to answer it in definitive ways, but I'll just give you my own insights of what I think. So the VRI did a variety of things. One thing is that it was focused, at least in terms of place, and including very specific street segments with the highest rates of violence and crime. So there was great attention to what was going on in those micro spaces, not only from a policing standpoint, and the policing was only one part of that, but also, were street lights out? Were there vacants where criminal activity was being engaged? Were there problematic alcohol outlets that seemed to be contributing to the violence? That was sort of the problem analysis that the city took to try to say, okay, there are different city agencies that can address some of those issues. And we know from other research in other places that when you actually address vacants and address, through what we refer to as cleaning and greening kind of opportunities, that the VRI at least was doing the cleaning part. I don't know how much the greening part was a component to that. That there's actually remarkable evidence that does lead to fewer violent crimes, including shootings. And some of our young people have already clued into that and have great ideas for how to do that even better. And really have youth committed to that. So I think it was a problem-focused orientation, and focus is always good, and multi-pronged approaches also very, very needed. So I think that those were probably some common denominators, but there are others who have been involved in this much more closely than I have on the ground who might have better, frankly, better insights about that.
Well, then if I can just hang that out there as a pending question for people that talk about it a little, I would like to. One of the things I'd like to add to your observations that I noticed, or at least I think I noticed, a lot of police officers that are involved with the VRI projects. Some of the other agencies take it for granted that they work together, that they're part of a team, like Public Works and DOT. Right. They're on the same road. One of them's paving it, the other one's putting a hole in it at the same time. But they know each other. They work together all the time. So basically, but police, my observation, VRI, they get very excited about the idea that they're part of a team. No one said those words to me, but it's obvious by watching people and listening to them that they're part of something that's happening that is part of a teamwork thing, and they are like into being part of that team. The people, the officers I've observed who are like at the community or the neighborhood unit level or anything else, then they turn out to be like, they can solve, you know, they learn how to solve a lot of these other problems, so that their opportunity to feel like they're not just out there on their own, but that they're part of some team that, you know, with shovels and brooms and drills all around. It's like doing something that means something.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there for sure. And it is something that, again, broader research will validate, that the communities most impacted by violence generally think that government doesn't care about them. They're not really addressing their problems. And the VRI at least was an attempt to sort of show those individuals in some of the most challenging neighborhoods that we face that, yeah, that they are coming together. It's not magical, it's not completely transformative perhaps as one would like, but it is a step in the right direction to building trust that I think is really key to leading to a safer city in Baltimore, is building those trusting relationships across agencies and community to government institutions, agencies.
So it's a good model for the whole city if it proves out to be, those factors of it that prove out to be a key to them. It's like, my image of VRI right now is, well, you had to have a kid book. It's like a Richard Scarry centerfold. It's like everybody's there doing their thing, and they're all in the same place, and it looks like a good place to be.
Yeah. Well, we need to fill these things in with really intensive assistance for the highest risk individuals to get them help, get them jobs, get them secure housing. All of those things really will lead to lasting things. But the communities need to know that the city cares about them, right, that they'll devote some resources and come together to solve their problems.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you. All right, so our next panel, we're going to bring up Granisha Martin, Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, James Timpson, Director of Safety and Community Partnerships, ROCA, Deidre Lane, Director of Safe Streets, Baltimore, Thomas App, author of Bleeding Out, Deputy Commissioner Sullivan, Baltimore Police Department, Connell Briscoe, Baltimore Police Department, or their representatives.
Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'll go first because I work with all these people to try to get a lot of the things in my office done. I do want to take an opportunity, though, to underscore what several people have said. It was probably the crowning achievement of this hearing for you to start with Antonio. I think we're all going to continue to refer back to what he said because he spoke truth. A lot of things that are being said today, Dr. Richardson, I've met with him, we're gonna partner. I've talked to Mr. Abt, talked to JT probably more than he wants to, a lot of people in the audience. But people keep talking about services, and people keep talking about resources. And we hear that all the time. People are talking about jobs, all these sorts of things. I don't want that to fall on deaf ears because it's what we hear all the time. I think sometimes, too, that feels overwhelming because you're like, where are we going to get the resources to give everybody jobs? How are we going to fix the education system? How are we going to do all the things that we know that have created the environment that many of our community members are suffering in every day? When somebody picks up a gun and takes another person's life or puts theirself in a position to have their life taken for $15, $20, $30, that's the tragedy that we're missing behind that number. And so what I have discovered since I've been back at the mayor's office and looking at what can we do around our gun violence issue is it seems that we've left two responses: the police and the coroner. I cannot find a robust programmatic response to the people who are shooting and being shot in our city. It's some here, it's some there, it's some a little bit of everywhere, but it is not a systematic, robust response such that if you have somebody from Safe Streets that has stopped somebody from shooting somebody that day, where can they refer them to so that they are not having to do that intervention the next day and the next day and the next day? I was just told a story yesterday about a quadriplegic because he'd been shot. Hard to find housing, hard to find the services. We have a phone tree. Can you call this person? Can you call this person? Can you call this? That should not be the answer in our city. And so one of the things when we talk about having to work together, the answers are in our communities. We have to, first of all, come around to make sure that the services that are there are actually responsive to the people who need it the most, and establish a standard of care and a continuum of care for the people in our city who we talk about trauma-informed care, we talk about trauma. If you have decided to pick up a gun to take somebody else's life, you are the most traumatized person in our city. And the services and the jobs and all of those things that come along with that have to be able to meet that person where they are. We can't ask them to come down to some pristine, psychologist's office and ask them to get the therapy that they need. So I digress. I'm way off my talking points, but I really want to lift that up, that if we're looking to fund, if we're looking to focus, if we're looking to talk about, if we're looking to take all the things that we have heard thus far and that we'll continue to hear tonight, it is a systematic focus on the services for the folks who need it the most. There are some people that need to go to jail. I'm not saying that everybody who's decided to take a life or try to take a life needs a job, but for the ones who would rather have a job than to stand on the corner with a gun, we have to have a response for them. And right now, we do not. I will tell you, and I'll go now into some of the things that I'm doing, based upon research, based upon talking to people in the community, at some of our anchor institutions. I have created a call, an RFP, for service providers who want to step up and actually want to address the folks that need it the most and help me come up with that standard of care and that service provider network. So just to back up a little bit, when the police commissioner came, he said that one of the reasons why he was successful in New Orleans was because he had a comprehensive violence reduction strategy. We cannot arrest our way out of the situation. And so we worked together to come up with a comprehensive violence reduction strategy that has 5 pillars. I'll just hit on those because I think BPD may talk about them a little bit. But there's prevention, intervention, enforcement, rehabilitation, and reentry. And so for prevention, we are focusing on schools and rec centers and the areas that we have concentrated violence. Our violence is concentrated in 5% of our city. And so we want to start there because we know we can't be all things to all people. Under intervention, we have Safe Streets. Dedra is not here tonight, but as I mentioned, one of the things that we have the outreach workers and Safe Streets workers who put their lives on the line every day to try to intervene in violence. But we have really sold them short in that they do not have anybody to turn to send those folks to. They often say, well, my friend has one space over here at this drug recovery, and maybe I can get a housing voucher for this one person. It should not be that difficult for them. They should be a hub of services that we help set up and provide. Also, we have to be thoughtful around the jobs that we're looking to create. You cannot take somebody off of a corner and throw them in a boardroom and expect for them to thrive. We have to meet them where they are and be thoughtful. And when we do the job development, we cannot send them home empty with nothing in their pocket because they're not coming back the next day. So we have to be thoughtful again and meet them where they are and make sure that as we build these job pipelines, we're talking to the community. I've been in communication with both the Mayor's Office of Employment Development, JOTF, other community-based providers. How do we create a pipeline for people to succeed? We are also piloting a shooting response. I've heard way too many times, we saw it in Dr. Richardson's video, once someone is shot, they go back to those circumstances highly traumatized. The people around them are highly traumatized, their family, the community, and there may be a retaliation, all sorts of things. So we're piloting this in the Eastern District. So when there is a shooting, several people come together and talk about what can we do to either stop the retaliatory violence or to get that family and the victim of the shooting services. The other thing that we are looking at is reentry. The Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice kind of focused on that a while back. It has not been a focus. I'm reinstituting that. We have people coming back to our communities on a regular basis with nothing to come back to. And some of the programs that they come back to, again, do not meet them where they are. They create additional obstacles. They don't judge themselves and hold themselves up to a mirror to look at whether the interventions that they're providing are actually helping to change the trajectory of folks' lives. So we, in the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, are going to turn back to reentry to try to rectify that gap. Additionally, since I've come back, I was invited to something called the Child Fatality Review. A lot of people don't know about this. It's a meeting that is held at the health department, and the basics of that meeting is to review all of the deaths of young people in our city. It's a meeting that should not have to happen, but it happens all too often. And I can tell you that you can look at the lives of these young people that starts at 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and you can literally see the demise that they're walking towards. You can see that with mental health issues with them, with their family, all sorts of things. And so we are working right now to come up with a system that not only responds when a young person has been shot to make sure the right services wrap around them, but then also what are the red flags that should pop up so we can say to schools, are you doing this? So we can say to police, are you doing this? You can say to MOCJ, are your programming, is ROCA responding? But how are we dealing with those so that we are not sitting there talking about young men being shot when we saw 12, 13, 14 years before that's where they were heading. One other thing that we're working on is we have ROCA, which JT will speak to, which I think is a huge, huge help to our city. But they work with young people 17 and up. We need to, and I've put together a group with both DSS, DJS, working with city schools. We need to have a response to the 13 to 17-year-olds. Science will tell you, Thomas will tell you, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, has been shown to have high levels of reduction in violence and recidivism. But CBT for a young person, 13 to 17, is completely different than what you're doing in Roca or for somebody 24 and up. By the time you're 24, you might have been shot a couple of times. You might have a child. You might have been to jail. You might be looking for the opportunity to change your life around. 13 to 17, you think you're invincible. And some of our young people are starting to do and be used by older folks to do some of the most heinous things in our city. So we've got to come together to figure out what are we doing for that population. We are looking at a model from Chicago that actually identifies youth from 10 all the way up to 24 and then matches up services with those youth. The last thing that I'll talk about is diversion. So the diversion program has kind of fallen off in the city, and so under the consent decree there was a report written by CCLP. We recently received funding from a local nonprofit who is going to help us push that work forward. We're currently working on policies with the police department through an equity lens to set up the policies and then the subsequent training so that we can start giving officers a opportunity to divert youth from what they're doing on the streets to actual positive programming. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
BBD.
Chairman, thank you. Council members, thank you for having us here for this very, very important discussion. We at the Baltimore Police Department know that we must treat root causes if we're going to have sustainable reductions in violence in the city, and not just the symptoms that are out there if we are to have a comprehensive violence reduction strategy. That strategy takes more than just the police department, which is what you've heard from everyone here tonight, and that's an approach that we gladly accept and need the help of the entire community to be able to make that happen. We recently outlined that approach in our crime reduction and departmental transformational plan, as Director Martin noted just a minute ago, and it takes a focus on more than just enforcement, but prevention, intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry if we're going to truly have an effect. Prevention, the work includes many of the work that's already being done out here. We have to be engaged with the youth and the young adults who are getting caught up in the criminal justice system at an early age. We have to, like was spoke about earlier, get upstream from many of these challenges of trauma, mental health, addiction, educational quality, and economic inequality that's present it's the reality of the youth in the city. You know, much of the intervention work includes street-level outreach that you heard about earlier tonight, and you'll hear about later, I'm sure, to work to interrupt the violence before it occurs. The work that Safe Streets is doing, the work that ROCA is doing is critical. We also must work on the rehabilitation efforts to help those faced with the disease of addiction and those challenged with mental illness, and give them opportunities to be healthy. And that's critically important. We're working to strengthen our LEAD program, which is law enforcement assisted diversion, to pull folks out of the criminal justice system and get them the help they need, rather than criminalize the disease that they are suffering from. Now, we're working with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice to create a system to connect folks, and you heard that from Director Martin, and you talked about those systems. We need to connect the faith-based communities, the neighborhood organizations, the educational institutions, healthcare providers, nonprofit service providers, and the broader community to make sure that we have a complete collaborative approach to being able to address this gun violence. We have to not forget to address the roots. Otherwise, we're going to be back here once again talking about these same things like Antonio talked about before. That frustration is felt probably no greater than the victims and the victims of families, but through the members of the police department that see this every day. It is extremely frustrating for us in this effort, and we welcome the help so we can not just focus on enforcement, but prevention, intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry, because all those areas, like has been spoke about many times tonight by each and every one of these speakers, is critically important, and we're committed to that work.
Thank you. Are you guys presenting together or separate? Colonel Briscoe.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, council members. Just to add to the conversation tonight from Deputy Commissioner Sullivan.
Your name and position.
My apologies.
Yep.
Colonel Briscoe, Chief of Detectives. Just to add to the conversation tonight that Deputy Commissioner Sullivan just illuminated on behalf of the Baltimore Police Department, and as well as Director Martin from the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, who we do partner with in much of our work. I just wanted to kind of add to this narrative thus far this year, the challenges that we face with gun violence in the police department. Of the 283 deaths of homicide, 256 of those were involved in firearms. Of our Part 1 UCR reportable crimes thus far for 2019, which have been 8,327 thus far, 3,139 of those involved firearms. Of the victims, of the 283 victims that have died as a result of homicide, 125 of them were previously arrested for gun crimes. I'm sure that the community in Baltimore knows just how staggering and challenging we have all been faced with gun violence. We have arrested thus far this year 967 individuals for handgun violations. So we are committed to the enforcement work, but this is an effort of the entire community, the entire village. All of the additional resources that are needed to come to the table from the lens of health, and all of the other partners that are needed, traditional and non-traditional, to combat this gun violence are essential. And we welcome and thank you for this opportunity to respond at this hearing, to just really acknowledge our level of commitment to the work and to our community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and community, council members. Where do I begin? I can only piggyback off of what.
Your name. And
oh, I'm sorry. I'm JT. I'm the Director of Community Partnerships and Safety for ROCA Baltimore. I can only start by really piggybacking off of what Tony said earlier. It's really the work that Tony's doing and the work that Joshua's doing. The work that they're doing is the work that's really going to lead the city into the type of reduction that we need to see amongst our youth, because they're the ones who are tapped into the pulse of what's going on with these young people. And I tell them all the time, like, I'm getting too old for it, so I'm looking for y'all to pave the way and let me back you up. Let me be that big voice behind you to help push the work that you're doing forward. But anyway, at ROCA Baltimore, we work with a population of 16 to 24-year-old young men who are highly criminally involved, who are at the highest risk of becoming either victims or perpetrators of homicide. In the past 2 weeks alone, we have had 3 young men in our program that have been murdered, and we've had another 3 that have been shot. Yesterday was the latest funeral. I know for me personally doing this work, I'm tired of going to funerals. I'm tired of seeing young people die. And I also echo the sentiment that as long as we as a city continue to work in silos, then young people will continue to die. So if we can't figure that out as adults, then guess what? Young people are going to continue to die. So we have to at some point figure out how to break down the silos, forget who got what, and figure out how we can work together, put it together to help young people live. So really, one of the biggest part of our work is the relentless outreach, because if you are really working with a high-risk population, they shouldn't be easy to find. They shouldn't be standing there just waiting for you to offer services to them and then just accept your services and run with you and follow behind you. They are where they are for a reason, and they do what they do for a reason. So our relentless outreach, or our approach to relentless outreach, is really one of the biggest keys to our success in working with these young people, because after we've worked with them, or after we pursued them as many times as we do, and we get clear that we're not law enforcement, because that's what they think we are most of the time, after we get all those misconceptions or confusions out the way, we're really able to start offering them services. We deal with a population of young people that are extremely traumatized, as well as just the city in general. People in the city in general are just traumatized. But specifically for our young people, the brain development shows us that young people are, between our age specifically, are stuck in fight, flight, or freeze, which means that their brains really are stuck in a survival mode. So what we have to learn to do programmatically is create pathways for these young people to move from the middle brain, which is called the limbic system, to the prefrontal cortex, which is executive functioning. And what that does is allows young people the opportunity to stay alive long enough to make better decisions, or make different decisions, or make different choices, which is what we say all the time. The purpose of the work that we do is really, at the end of the day, is really to help young people stay alive long enough to make better decisions, different decisions, or offer them the services that they need to help change their lives. We build trusting relationships with them. Any of the young people in the program will tell you that as much as we get on their nerves and as much as they get on ours, at the end of the day, they know that we're always going to be there and they can come back to us for anything. But back to the brain development, the way that we address a lot of the trauma that we see in the young people in our population is through CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy. The cognitive behavioral therapy, ours is called cognitive behavioral theory. It was developed for paraprofessionals specifically to be able to take the intervention out into the community and work with people where they are. It was designed to be done by paraprofessionals. So it's 7 skills that are really designed to teach young people how to emotionally regulate. And when we talk about emotional regulation, all we're looking for is an 8 to 10 second pause between problem and action that will allow a young person to make a better decision or a better choice about what their future is going to look like between that 8 and 10 seconds. So we take this approach to young people where they are. We go find them in the community. It's designed to be done formally and informally, but the most success of any programming that we do is because the programming that we do is designed to meet young people where they are. We take the programming to them. So there's no young person that could call me and tell me he needs GED, and I'll say, oh, well, you got to come into the office to get GED. No. If he needs GED and he's out there in the streets and that's the only place we could find him, my educators are going out in the street and we're going to offer him GED in the streets. If he's willing to sit there and listen, we willing to sit there and work with him. And that's with any of our programming. The other thing too is that young people have to understand that they are allowed to make mistakes and be able to recover from the mistakes without being judged or without being thrown under the bus or without being kicked out or whatever the case is. I could tell you stories of stuff that our young people have done where most people will probably be like, oh man, if they did that, we'd have called the police or we'd have kicked them out. That's not servicing that young person. It's really about having a conversation about that behavior and really finding out what the root of it, where did it come from? You know, it's less about, at some point it becomes less about what they did or how they are, and more importantly, finding out how they got how they got to be the way that they are, or why they got there. We really have to take the time to be less judgmental and really work with young people where they are. And that's one of the biggest things that we try to promote with the program. Lastly, I'll just share a story I'll just share the idea of really looking at young people's networks. See, Baltimore is set up different now. Baltimore used to be a city divided by east and west. And so the divide was very clear. If you were from east, you didn't go west. If you were from west, you didn't go east. Now young people move all throughout the city, right? They move throughout the city and they do dirt everywhere, anywhere opportunity presents itself. If we aren't keeping up with the dynamics of the way that young people operate or the reason why they operate the way that they operate, and then we're never going to get the problem solved, one. Two, we really have to pay attention to how what happens in the neighborhood and what happens to specific young people affects their network around them, affects their friends, their family, everybody else around them. If we don't address it holistically or as a whole, sometimes it's not really about addressing the young person that got shot immediately. It's more about addressing the friends and family around that may perpetrate the next act of violence because that person is laying in the hospital. We have to be able to connect to young people. We have to hear the voice of young people. We have to listen to young people. We have to let them lead us. The question was asked, like, what does it look like for a youth-led movement? And I'm glad you called Tony back up here to ask him what that looked like, because that's who the answer should come from. It should come from the young people. I can't tell you what it should look like. I can only tell you that we have to do everything possible to try to make sure that we give them the voice and the platform to be successful or to push forward what they feel like is going to work. And one thing that I have to highlight about working with Tony and Joshua over the past year. So Tony came up to me last year after I spoke at another event, and we started talking. He started talking to me about, every town and student demand action, and he started talking to me about how he was so upset about the way every town was presenting gun violence. And I said, dang, look at this young dude talking about the way that a national organization is presenting gun violence, because they presented it as a mass shooting problem. Like all gun violence in America is about mass shootings. And we know that that's not true, because in Baltimore, the chances of a mass shooting are way less than one of your homeboys getting shot leaving out the door. And so part of that was he was really adamant about helping to make that national platform change the way that they were talking about gun violence, specifically in urban cities. I got a call about 3 weeks ago from Everytown who wanted to come sit down at the table and figure out what we were doing at Roca. And when I sat down with them and I listened to the way that they were describing how they were looking at gun violence, I said, wow, somebody actually listened to the voice of these youth and really did something about changing the way that they started to view violence. Because they were talking about it now to me from an urban point of view, or from an urban standpoint, and it's the same things that Tony and Joshua were saying to me about the problems that they had with it. Like, nah, they need to change, they need to look at it this way, they need to really consider this, they need to, and so I said, wow. Like, I was so excited to see them tonight to tell them, like, yo, like y'all really set your platform and y'all really made those people start talking different about gun violence and how it looks in urban cities. That's what it's about. That's what it's gonna take. It's gonna take programs, collaborated efforts, the voice of young people. It's gonna take us all. Far gone is the day where we work in silos. I will say it again. If we think the police are our enemies, kids will continue to die. If we think that the program down the street is the enemy, kids will continue to die. If we cannot work together and break down these silos, kids will continue to die. We cannot allow for this to continue to happen. It has to stop. It has to change. And we have to be the vehicles to help move this forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Thomas Apt. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you. I congratulate the committee on holding a hearing on this critically important subject. And what I'm about to talk about is really just a fancy version of what many other people have talked about, what Ganesha and JT have talked about. But I'm going to talk about it with a little more reference to some of the science on these things. And so let's just begin with Baltimore. Last year there were 309 homicides, homicide rate of 51 per 100,000, the second highest in the nation, and the city is consistently ranked among the highest or among the deadliest per capita for the past 20 years. This year the homicides, both in absolute number and rates, are up again. It should be crystal clear that reducing lethal violence to keep Baltimoreans alive and also out of prison is the #1 public policy challenge facing the city. Every homicide causes immense personal suffering. There's no way to describe the loss that a mother feels having lost a child, or a friend having lost a friend, or any of those things. And we need to respect that. But there are scientific ways to calculate all of the various direct and indirect costs of murder. And in 2018, homicide collectively cost this city approximately $3.1 billion in criminal justice, medical costs, lost wages, diminished property values, and reduced quality of life. And that's not even touching all of the untouchables that can never be quantified. Murderous violence in Baltimore has destroyed lives, devastated communities, and stained the city's reputation. The city really stands at a crossroads. Will it continue to suffer the fate of other localities that have been unable to contain violence that will result in depopulation, disinvestment, and decline? Or will the city join the ranks of cities that are safe, growing, and vibrant? In my brief time with you today, I want to emphasize 3 points on how Baltimore can keep its citizens alive and free. These points aren't based on my personal or professional experiences, although I have seen urban violence up close as an inner city high school teacher. I've seen it as a line prosecutor, and I've also worked on it at the federal and state levels as a policymaker. Instead, these points are based on evidence, rigorous social scientific evidence drawn from not one, not dozens, but hundreds of impact evaluations of anti-violence programs in the U.S. and across the country. This evidence is summarized in the book that a couple of people had mentioned, Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets, but I'll provide an overview of that evidence for you right now. First, to be successful in reducing urban violence, policymakers must adopt strategies that are focused. Urban violence is sticky, meaning that it clusters together among a surprisingly small number of people and places. In New Orleans, for instance, one study revealed that a tiny network of less than 1% of the city's population accounted for more than half of its lethal incidents. In Oakland, another analysis discovered that only some 400 individuals, about 0.1% of Oakland's population, were at the highest risk for violence at any particular point in time. And in cities all across the nation, including this one, small numbers of violent crime hotspots, no more than a block or two in size, drive the majority of crime and violence within city limits. Now, because urban violence is sticky, it shouldn't be surprising to learn that the evidence shows that sticky solutions work best in actually reducing such behavior. Again and again, when we look at the evidence, we see that interventions that focus on the most dangerous people and the most dangerous places demonstrate the best results. That means that Baltimore, in order to be successful, must identify, engage, and address violence among the tiny fraction of people and places that account for the majority of the city's violence. There are a number of strategies that adopt this intense level of concentration. Focused deterrence, CBT, something that JT and Roca use. Hotspots policing. These are all a few well-known options. Street outreach, which has also been discussed. But whatever Baltimore chooses to do, it should be highly focused. Second, efforts to address urban violence must just not be focused, they also have to be balanced. When you examine the full range of anti-violence options from hardest to softest, the most rigorous evidence doesn't actually appear to favor one side over the other. Therefore, policymakers have to balance public safety approaches with public health approaches and offer the highest risk individuals not just punishment, but also support, treatment, and assistance. It also means not just policing hotspots, but investing in them, as a conversation I just had with a young man here from Baltimore. No city has successfully and sustainably reduced violence by just arresting their way out of the problem. But it is also true that no city has successfully just programmed their way out of the problem. Cities need a balance of both sticks and carrots in order to keep the peace. Third and lastly, in addition to being focused and balanced, efforts to reduce gun violence have to be fair. Fairness in this context means that whatever set of strategies a city might adopt to control violence, those strategies have to be perceived as legitimate by the people who are impacted most by them. When residents don't believe in the system, they don't use it. If community members do not believe that the police and others are able and willing to help them, they will refuse to offer information. They won't serve as witnesses. They won't act as jurors or call 911. But most importantly, they won't use the system for perhaps its oldest function, which is the nonviolent resolution of disputes. In neighborhoods where trust in law enforcement is low, people don't call the police for help. Instead, they call their friends, their family members, their associates, often resulting in long cycles of retaliatory violence. Now, given the complicated and often difficult relationships in Baltimore between police and many communities of color, it might be tempting to view public health strategies as an alternative to law enforcement. That would be a mistake. Ultimately, success in Baltimore will depend on the contributions of both fields, not on one or the other. The most successful cities reject extreme activism and advocacy that insists on relying entirely on the police or not working with them at all. Public health officials, service providers, and community members must collaborate with law enforcement, and vice versa, no matter how difficult it may seem politically. Let me provide one example of how these principles work in practice. A strategy called focused deterrence brings together community members, social service providers, and law enforcement officials to confront the individuals and groups at the highest risk of shooting or being shot. And their message is very simple. The killing must end now. If you let us, we will help you. If you make us, we will stop you. Then that partnership follows up with life coaching, job training, educational opportunities, and other forms of assistance, along with narrowly targeted investigations, arrests, and prosecutions for those who persist in violent behavior. A recent review I know that this strategy has been tried before in Baltimore, but hear me out. A recent review of the strategy found it successful 19 of the 24 times it was rigorously evaluated, producing large reductions in shootings and killings in those instances. In New Orleans, the strategy was responsible for a reduction in homicide of almost 20% between 2008 and 2013. And in Oakland, a place where the strategy had failed not once, but twice before, ultimately the strategy has resulted in a 50% reduction in gun violence since 2012. This strategy is no panacea, but when it does work, it works because it's focused, meaning it targets only the highest risk individuals, because it's balanced, it offers them both punishments and rewards, and it's fair. It represents a broad coalition to offer individuals an informed choice about their own future. Now, focused deterrence isn't known as a public health strategy, but it could be. Public health providers and community members could link arms with law enforcement to confront the city's criminals with a message of empathy, but also accountability. Whatever strategy or set of strategies the city implements, my hope is that those strategies will be based on the evidence of what actually works to reduce violence, and that they collectively will be focused, balanced, and fair. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from the committee? Sure. Councilman Reisinger.
I'll try to make it brief. First of all, Mr. Chair, I want to thank you for holding this informational hearing. I've learned a lot, and again, I want to thank you for what you've done bringing this together. I just want to comment on some of the speakers, like Kanisha and James, in regards to, we can't police a way out of this, and there are people out there that need to go to jail for what they do. And we can have the VRI with the police department and foot patrolmen, and also on the other side is regards to we need jobs, rec centers having programs to save streets. But I just want to give you an example when you're talking about young people and strategy and outreach in my district. I got to tell you the story. Cherry Hill, as of today, I was over there for a meeting, have 0 homicides and very few shootings. Cherry Hill has a large sector of public housing units. They have a lot of youth. And to have 0 homicides and very few shootings is because they have what we've been talking about is outreach to our youth. This community is out there. They have men who was born and raised in Cherry Hill, have moved out, still live there, and they have what's called the Cherry Hill Eagles, where they take the young youth, the kids from Cherry Hill, and they teach them to play football. They play teams within the state, out of state, and they are getting some grant money now. But I went to a dinner they had, and it was potluck, and it was the community that brought this together, small business people, men and women that live in Cherry Hill, and they did it themselves. And that really meant a lot to me for what they did. And right now they're out there, they have a 501c3, but they just don't teach the kids football. They do a lot of mentoring. They have cookouts, they have games for the kids, and they have back to school supplies, cookout. I've been there for the last 4 or 5 years. And I just want to say that they have a strong Safe Streets, and this Safe Streets works with the Cherry Hill Eagles. They have a public safety committee that meets once a month, Cleota Walker and Cherry Hill, and all the different community leaders and all come to that meeting. And that's what you were talking about earlier. The strategy is comprehensive, Kanisha, where the community comes together, and whenever there's a shooting, they have these prayer walks, and they go to the spot, and they communicate with each other. And the heart is in Cherry Hill. And if Cherry Hill can do this, then the whole city of Baltimore can do it. And my last story back in 2015 with the Freddie Gray incident, when you had the National Guard and the state police and they were out there, I went over to Cherry Hill to a cookout. There was no National Guard, there was no police, because they policed themselves and they work together as a community. And I think that we do need the police department, but I think that the strategy is like with ROCO, but also the strategy is with the community to work together to help our youth. So, Mr. Chair, thanks for giving me that time to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had a few questions. Start with Director Martin. One of the reoccurring themes that we've heard here tonight is the need to reduce silos, to work collaboratively, both with law enforcement and community. Can you talk about your agency's focus in this particular area at convening organizations, stakeholders to push that effort forward? And also, you mentioned, second question, you mentioned that most of the violence in Baltimore is occurring in 5% of the city. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, and then speak to how the response from MOCJ and the collaborative efforts have focused on these particular areas in particular?
Right, so they're actually very interrelated. I'll start with the last one. What we're doing at MOCJ is, the police commissioner identified micro zones across the city. They comprise the areas that we have the highest amount of violence. So what I've done recently is I called 2 community meetings, specifically with folks who both in East and West Baltimore are dedicated to the reduction of violence in their communities, to talk about how can the mayor's office buttress what they're supposed to be, or not supposed to be, what they're trying to do, because the mayor's office is not supposed to be the answer. We're supposed to be supporting the community to build the capacity so that they can do what they need to do for themselves and their loved ones. So we started that. What came out of that and you can recognize this because you've done something similar in human trafficking, is we can sit there and we can talk all day about me asking them to take some of their work and actually do it in the microzone. So how can we activate? But again, it goes back to what the young man said, money. So right now, one of the things I'm trying to do is find money in my own budget and perhaps raise money and apply for grants for grants, so that when I talk to the communities and they say, I'm doing X, Y, and Z, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. JT has the young folks that he's trying to rear up so that they can be interveners. How can we support them in the work that they're doing and bring them together so it is a cohesive response? My mantra in my role is we should all be focusing on the same people in the same places at the same time. There's no reason for us to have all of this ad hoc kind of you're over here, you're over there. Now, one of the things that I would say and that JT spoke to is that when I had the community meetings, there was a lot of side eye that was given. There was people that didn't like such and such and didn't like such and such. And that's not something that I can necessarily fix. But again, it goes back to the silos, and I do think that we have to have a moment, whether it's community-led or the mayor's office, where people say, whatever happened in the past is whatever. If somebody's coming with some resources and coming with the infrastructure to try to focus the way that we need to focus in our communities to reduce the violence, then let's move forward. So since then, I've met with, instead of having this big group meeting, I've been meeting with individual organizations, because the numbers that Thomas Abb was able to quote were in large part because of community coming together to say no more, and that we're going to all work together to reduce that violence. The other thing that I'm doing, which I mentioned earlier, I think I'm probably the only Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice Director that's meeting with DSS. Because like we said, we can see the statistics that the young people that are either being shot or shooting had their first touch with government at 2 and 3 and 4 years old with DSS. So DSS, both DJS, met with them today. I've been meeting with them even before my first day back. What are the programs that they have once the young people, if they are incarcerated, what are they doing to actually set them up for when they come back out to be able to roll right back into school, roll right back into a job? So bringing together community groups that are working with that are youth led, so to have those conversations about what we can do. I'm forgetting the other part of your question.
Well, you sort of hit on it, where just the silos. I mean, that was.
Yeah, I do hope though from this meeting, and I'm taking down names. We have to do it in a not only a collaborative way, but in a way where we kind of set up an agenda. Here are the 4 or 5 things that we say that we're going to accomplish. Here is your role, here is your role, here is your role, here is your role. And we continuously hold each other accountable to show up and activate in the way that we need to in our particular roles. That is not happening right now. The conversations I mentioned are just the beginning of that, but this convening really should be the catalyst for that to happen, to flow from here, because you have all of those pieces. The service providers are not here, but I'm working on that. But other than that, this convening could create the infrastructure for that to move forward, and I'm very happy to take the efforts that I'm already doing and fold that into this so that can happen.
Absolutely, and we can talk a little bit about offline about the work that I do as the co-chair of the Human Trafficking Collaborative and some of the outcomes that we've seen from simply having space for folks to work. We have over 50 members who are helping victims of human trafficking or working to hold traffickers accountable, and just simply having that space on a regular occurring basis with unified goals, subcommittees that are actually doing work. We've actually seen much more of a collaborative response to that issue, and I think we can do the same thing on gun violence. So
absolutely, I'm here to help you.
My next question was for Mr. Abt. You had 2 questions for you. One, you mentioned focused deterrence. Can you speak to where that has worked particularly well? I guess you can start there.
Sure. So places it's worked well, I mentioned Oakland, I mentioned New Orleans. It's worked well in Pittsburgh. It's worked well in New Haven. It's had success in Chicago. Essentially, the systematic review that was performed last year in 2018 identified 12 times that the particular type of focused deterrence that we're talking about here, gun and group violence reduction, was evaluated. It was successful 12 out of 12 times. When it doesn't work, it's actually often for a lot of the reasons that we've discussed here and a lot of the reasons that it fell apart here in Baltimore previously, which is the partnerships that are necessary to do the work didn't come together. And ultimately, this work is only as strong as the partnerships that it's founded on.
And the second question I had for you was one of the things that I think it was you mentioned, or one of our previous speakers mentioned, that is the issue of trust and the willingness to come forward. And this is something that I see regularly in my district. I'll give a short story in that 2 summers ago, there was a murder right in front of my house. I live in West Baltimore. And one of my neighbors saw the entire thing. It was right in the middle of the day, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Knew who the shooter was. It was a guy who lived on the block. Did not know who the victim was, but did see the entire incident go down as she was running to her house. Obviously, she knew who I was. I lived 2 doors down from her. So, she gave me the whole rundown on what occurred, but ultimately was not willing at all to speak to law enforcement. And this was right on at the beginning of the conversation or revelations around the Gun Trace Task Force. And her response to me was, Burnett, how do I know the officers are not going to run up in my house? You told me you had, knew about this guy. He'd been selling drugs in our block. How do we know the police aren't in on it? And to date, has refused to come forward. Also, last week I see this guy driving through the neighborhood. He still hangs out at the Edmondson Village Shopping Center. I see him grabbing food at the Popeyes as if nothing occurred. And there are people who know who he was, who he did it. His family members live around the corner. Nobody's willing to come forward. And I've had other incidences just 2 days ago where faculty at a high school in my district witnessed a very serious incident, and the first person they called was me. And I appreciate that they, and many of and these are just a few where people have come to me first with information, or come to my staff, or call our offices, and I'm sure this is the same for my colleagues, that they have that trust in their elected official, which I'm thankful, because we aren't necessarily highest on that totem pole either, people go to for trust and honesty, and I appreciate that. But ultimately, I don't work in law enforcement. I don't work as a service provider. I'm an elected official. And obviously, I can get that information out and get a response probably quicker than they may be able to in some instances. But ultimately, if people don't feel comfortable coming forward with information, in my experience, it continues that cycle, because folks who are committing these acts feel that there's not going to be a consequence. And so, can you speak to what needs to be done, or in your understanding what needs to be done to restore trust, not only just with law enforcement, but with with government in general, as a entity that people can believe can, whether it's through policy change, can make an impact on their lives? Because we've talked a lot about the need to continue to swim upstream, and we've heard a lot of testimony this evening on sort of the other issues that contribute to violence, which I wholeheartedly agree with, which is why we call this hearing in the first place. But trust in those institutions needs to be restored for people to feel comfortable, because if they're not going to be, in the same way that they may not come forward to a law enforcement official, when I've done resource fairs on Frederick Avenue, it's difficult to get people to come from Edmondson Avenue down there, and vice versa. So they're not going to move, and part of it's that trust factor isn't there. They don't know what's waiting for them on the other side, and they don't believe that those institutions have their best interest at hand. And the history of the city has been that those institutions largely have not. Can you speak to where that change, you've seen that shift happen, if at all, in other municipalities, and what some of the strategies that were used to make that change?
Sure. It's such an important question, and it's a question that my colleague Daniel Webster and I have talked a lot about. this is something that comes up in many cities, not just Baltimore. And you'll have a devastating shooting. There will be no suspects identified, and the call will often be from law enforcement. The statement will be, well, if the community doesn't step up, there's nothing we can do, and the community has to step up, and they have to provide information for this to happen. And there's an element of truth to that. Ultimately, we do need to create an environment where people feel comfortable coming forward. But one of the things that I think we often neglect is that there's a lot we can do in our own backyard, speaking in terms of law enforcement, to make people, when they provide information, feel much more comfortable, and to improve homicide clearance rates and gun assault clearance rates. There are things in terms of assigning more detectives. There's things in terms of making sure that people can work continuously without being taken off a case in the middle. There are improved investigative practices. There are many things that police departments can do on their own to improve trust and to increase clearance rates. And also, I think we also have to think about witness protection. In too many cities, possibly here in Baltimore, the notion of witness protection is a couple nights in a hotel on the other side of town. That's not going to change people's incentives in terms of testifying or not testifying. And so we need to think about doing a variety of those things. And then I think we can really, when we ask people to come forward, we have a much more responsive and a much more effective system that they can then connect with. Because ultimately, one of the things we have to notice is that in these communities that are suffering from high rates of incarceration and high rates of violence, people aren't just unhappy about being hassled by the police and unhappy about being stopped or searched or things like that. They're also unhappy that the violence has not stopped. And all of those complaints are justified. So what I would say is that we have concrete evidence showing that there are things that we can do in terms of increasing resources, changing practices in our own backyard to start changing this cycle. And then once we've done those things, then we can come back to the community and say, look, we've done what we need to on our end. Please do what you can on yours.
Thank you. Okay. So I do want to take a point of privilege and take a 2-minute recess. We've covered a lot of ground here. I know people may want to use the restrooms, so we're going to switch out the panel. I want to say thank you to all of our speakers who've come to this point, and we're going to recess for 2 minutes. All right, everybody, we're going to bring it back. The hearing is reconvening. Hello. Hey.
Dr. Richardson. Dr. Richardson.
All right. So thank you, everybody. We're going to reconvene. We're coming down. We have one more panel. I want to make sure we get through it. All right, so next up, we have Davon Love, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Latrice Grant, Baltimore Ceasefire, Joshua Turner, Students Demand Action, Ryan Turner, Executive Director of CLIA, and I didn't see Michael Cornish here, but he's with Dads United organization. And it looks like Latrice is leading us off, the ceasefire movement.
So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the discussion. I really appreciate the opportunity to share. For the people in the room who don't know, Baltimore Ceasefire is a community-led movement. We are not a formal organization. It's made up of essentially residents in Baltimore City who volunteer in their spare time to help to reduce gun violence in Baltimore. That's essentially what it is that we do. I have some questions and I have some comments. What does it mean to you? And I'm speaking to everyone in the room. What does it mean to you to shift your priorities as a person in a position of perceived power to helping people in the city instead of helping, aiding, and abetting systems. Why did we let our city get like this? Who benefits from a blighted, stressed, bullied city like Baltimore? What systems thrive when residents become more and more brittle? You can't legislate hope into the hearts of people, but you can legislate death into the fabric of a community. You can legislate and police the dignity and esteem out of the people in a city. It is my humble opinion, and I've said time and time again, that Baltimore as a community has an inability to manage conflict, and that is our problem at its core. Trauma exacerbates our inability to manage conflict. Lead, for example, exacerbates our inability to manage conflict. When research shows that ads outside of alcohol outlets contribute to violence, but we protect store owners instead of the vulnerable communities that they leech off of, something is wrong. Humanizing people is important. It is not us against them, it is us assisting us. When we go home at the end of the night, we're all Baltimoreans and our neighbors are dying and our community is hurting. Ceasefire is not how I make my money, so I will still be able to eat when murder is not an epidemic in my city. And that's not a dig at anyone who makes their living doing this. I'm just saying I will still be able to eat when murder is no longer an epidemic in my city. Maybe because I don't have numbers, statistics, ambition, and other inhumane priorities in the front of my mind, I can feel a little differently. Knowing that we have answers, but don't prioritize the answers hurts. Knowing what doesn't work, but pouring tons and tons of resources into them hurts. And I want to offer to people here that one of the reasons that we work in silos is because people who do this work are traumatized as well. And they struggle through their trauma while trying to do this work and harm people in the process. Baltimore Ceasefire, the gentleman who spoke about Cherry Hill and about how that community essentially rallied around itself to save itself, is the essence of Baltimore Ceasefire. On Baltimore Ceasefire weekends, people in community, everyday, quote unquote, regular people who live in Baltimore decide for themselves what they want their city to look like. Even if it's only for 72 hours, people find hope that they probably had to dig very deeply to access, to create life-affirming events for people in their communities, to remind people in Baltimore City that they are loved, to remind people in Baltimore City that they are not animals, to remind people in Baltimore City that they are important. And we have a very simple ask: nobody kill anybody. Peter Phelan did some comprehensive research about how ceasefire weekends impact Baltimore City. And on the low end, ceasefire weekends reduce shootings by 30%. On the high end, ceasefires reduce shootings by as much as 60%. And it's just because we ask people to not kill each other. It's only because we as a city ask one another to not kill each other. So I respect all of the work that goes into crunching numbers and figuring things out. But at the end of the day, Baltimore is made up of people. And when you disinvest in people, when you try to police your way around trauma, you get 300 plus murders per year. And I'm tired of people dying in my city because people have priorities that don't match the needs of the people in Baltimore City. People in the city are hurting, and they have been hurting for a very long time. And if we're not going to address the hurt, if we are not going to address our inability to manage conflict without violence, if we continue to focus on things that support systems and not people, we will continue to have a murder and violence epidemic in Baltimore City. Thank you.
Davon Love.
All right. My name is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I was actually going to, most of my commentary is going to be about the public policy conversations about public safety, because a lot of the speakers before have addressed many of the systemic issues, the necessity for a public health approach to dealing with gun violence. And have talked about the importance of a variety of different interventions and working together. I do want to add something that I think often gets left out of the conversation in thinking about public safety and the question of violence, and that is that, you know, we live in a society structured on racism and white supremacy. And one of the ways that that manifests itself is the ways in which images of black criminality and pathology are ubiquitous. And so that impacts, those are the images, whether it's popular culture, whether it's the news media, whether it's public education. Those narratives are constantly made available, particularly to young black men, those who are the biggest perpetrators and victims of gun violence in Baltimore City. Amos Wilson, in his book, Black on Black Violence, describes the phenomena of high rates of homicides in cities like Baltimore as an externalization of a suicidal impulse. That when you have no value for your own life, and when society has constantly given you signals, whether it's the building you go to school in, or the block that you live in, the language that is used to characterize you and your peers, that you then don't have a value for yourself, and it's easy then to kill someone who looks like you. And I say, the reason why I say that, because again, most of my commentary is about the public policy conversations, but the reason why I say that is because many of those that are going to be providing services in this public health approach must incorporate that as a part of the strategy for dealing particularly with young black men to develop alternatives to engaging in violence. And when we talk about the kinds of programs that do things like address black male identity development in ways that provide the tools to be able to effectively address conflict, things like African Center Rites of Passage, and other kinds of programs that look at how to embed those tools of conflict resolution and how to improve the self-worth. I mean, even if you look at European social science, self-actualization is what is described as the highest level of mental health. And so how can one engage in self-actualization without the tools of self-knowledge necessary to love yourself enough, to love the people in your community enough, to have deterrence in terms of engaging in violence? So that's a very important point as it relates to the programmatic arm of the public safety approach to issues of gun violence. All right, so like I mentioned, most of my commentary, though, is going to be about the public policy conversations that have happened over the past few years about gun violence and some of the responses, and making some recommendations to the council. The first is that much of the conversations that have been had in the public as it relates to policy and addressing public safety have revolved around two major buckets. One has been oversight of the judiciary, and the other has been sentence enhancements and mandatory minimums. And I'm going to start with this question of oversight over the judiciary, because I'm not going to go deep into that. The conversations about oversight over judges and criticism of judges handing down light sentences to those that have been incarcerated, who've been charged before and convicted. The problem with this, the two problems with that emphasis. One is you start to infringe on the importance of the independence of the judiciary. And it frames out the fact that the judge is the last line of the process in many ways. When you think about the fact that law enforcement has to go out and charge, law enforcement has to go up and get the evidence that then a prosecutor would use to charge somebody for homicide. And so looking at the judges and criticizing their decisions doesn't take in consideration what was the quality of the case put before them, and what is the quality of the evidence that was given to the prosecutors to make the case for those who in many communities, folks know who the folks who are committing homicide are, right? But the inability to get the information necessary to prosecute an effective case, to go after those that are engaged in homicide and violence. The other, sentence enhancements and mandatory minimums. And this is an approach that drastically misses the mark for a variety of reasons. One is that sentence enhancements as an approach to gun violence assumes that the laws that are already on the books are not harsh enough. One of the best examples of that was a bill that came through the Baltimore City Council in 2017, where there was a heightened panic about gun violence, and so there was a proposal for a 1-year mandatory minimum for mere gun possession in public places. The council amended the bill such that it wasn't just mere possession, but it was mere possession in the act of a violent crime, 1-year mandatory minimum. What's fascinating about that is that the law that is already on the books at a state law is that that's actually a mandatory 5-year already. So the bill, even though its intention was to use this tough on crime approach, right, it actually went the opposite direction of the proponents of that piece of legislation. So what it goes to show is that the approach of sentence enhancements as a response to gun violence, that was a political one, not one that actually aims to address the actual problems. The other piece is that many people know that many cases don't actually go to trial. So then you're dealing with plea bargains. What sentence enhancements do is they create more leverage for prosecutors in plea bargains in such a way that it leads to greater amounts of time for those who are then convicted. And if we know about the limitations of people being able to access proper representation, and what we know about the impact of mass incarceration, where you essentially have tracked hundreds of thousands of people into the criminal justice system who do not belong. And again, that's not even just a matter of conjecture at this point. I mean, at the state level, you have the Justice Reinvestment Act and a bunch of other, the ban the box, a bunch of other policies that recognize the ways in which people who should not be incarcerated were tracked into the system. So increasing the leverage for prosecutors with sentence enhancements impacts those who many of us would say do not belong in jail and to be incarcerated. Lastly, sentence enhancements just don't work. The National Institute for Justice says that it is not the length of the crime that is a deterrent to violence. It is the certainty that you'll get caught that is the greatest deterrent from law enforcement and violent crime. And so many of the studies that have been done on sentence enhancements in areas where there's an attempt to deal with gun violence, most of them suggest that there was no reduction in crime. There was one, I think it was a UPenn study that had like a 3% reduction in crime, and lots of people actually questioned the legitimacy of that particular study. So the overwhelming evidence has been, and again, the National Institute of Justice, a study that came out of the Department of Justice years ago, studied the different information areas about sentence enhancements. So again, the impact that sentence enhancement has is that we're in an environment now where we recognize mass incarceration. Its impact is actually that it harms those that should not be incarcerated. All right, so in terms of where we actually need to look in terms of addressing homicide and violence, because some of the previous speakers had made the comment that in pursuing a public health approach to public safety, that we should not forsake the role of law enforcement, right? And while I think that's an important piece of the conversation, I think it was framed slightly in a misleading way. What I mean by that is this, is that you cannot have a partnership with an institution from which you do not have any mechanisms of accountability. And so a part of what my organization has been fighting for several years has been about police accountability. Most of it has been in the context of dealing with issues of police brutality. But there's also an important role for police accountability as it relates to public safety. And I'll actually give an example. Several years ago, I actually was an aide to the councilwoman who was the predecessor of the chairman at a community meeting in Irvington. And there was a representative from the police department there, one of the majors. And so folks were complaining about the fact that that officer, who was parked at the gas station on Augusta and Frederick, would not get out of the car and walk around. And so this is what the residents complained about. Well, what the major says, so the major in the meeting just says, okay, cool, and moves on to the next thing. So then eventually somebody stands up and says, well, wait a minute, we asked you a question about your officer who was sitting in their car, like, what are we gonna do about this? And the response the major gave was, well, I have bad employees like anybody else has bad employees. And so I can suggest to them that, you know, they should get out of the car, but I don't know that me urging them to do so will change their behavior, right? To me, that's an example that suggests that the infrastructure that the police department has been allowed to operate under, where there's very little oversight and accountability from those who they say they're tasked with serving, makes a partnership nonsensical, because a partnership requires the ability for mutual negotiation and power. And so what I'll leave you with is that on the question of police accountability, and as I mentioned before, the other conversations about public safety, the critiques of the judiciary, the approaches to sentence enhancements and mandatory minimums, do not address the fundamental fact that if we're dealing with law enforcement, which as it exists currently is the mechanism of the state to deal with issues of homicide, then there has to be an ability to hold them accountable. One of the things that we've worked on the state level with our partners from the ACLU has been the Maryland Public Information Act. Currently, personnel records of law enforcement are not available to the public because they're considered personnel records. Investigatory files about the patterns and behaviors of those officers are not available to the public. And so as a result, if you're a person wanting to hold that department accountable, you don't have access to the information you need to do so. And so if we're serious about making the department more able to focus its attention on zeroing in on those that are the drivers of homicide and violence, there has to be a willingness. And think about this, that in an environment where there is no oversight, then of course you're gonna have corruption that bubbles up as a result. And I think the Gun Trace Task Force is a great example of an environment, of an infrastructure that facilitates corruption. You would expect nothing else if an institution was completely insulated from outside accountability and the ability to root out those not only who were engaged in brutality against those in our community, which has traditionally been LBS's argument on police reform, but also in being able for the public, as the example I gave in that meeting, to say to the police department, that person has to go because they're not seriously doing the work and the business of going after those that are the drivers of homicide and violence. So the Maryland Public Information Act is a policy that LBS and the ACLU is going to pursue during the Maryland General Assembly. And that's one step that we hope to police accountability that you all can support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you, Chairman, for having me on today. I just wish that more people would have stayed because of the gravity of this issue, insofar as a lot of people here have a lot of great value to add to the conversation, and it should be seen out to its very fruition. So before I begin, I want to give full disclosure. Yes, I'm a member of Students Demand Action Baltimore. I'm also currently leading the chapter. I also serve on the Everytown's National Advisory Board to go ahead and further push forward the issues of urban gun violence. However, today I'm standing here as not only Students Demand Action, but as myself, as someone who's been personally impacted by this issue on a daily basis with the work I've engaged in when it comes down to this issue. So first thing I want to address is that, say it again?
We need your name.
Oh yeah, Joshua Turner again. So the first thing I want to address again is that the urban gun violence epidemic in Baltimore is something that's persisted for a very, very long time. And I'll argue that we have ignored some of the basic principles of economics when it comes down to this issue. We have to ask ourselves the fundamental question of what happens when you strip an area of its resources. We see that these areas that have high volumes of gun violence and crime are oftentimes referred to as micro zones, but I would like to refer to them as scarcity zones. Economics is meant to go ahead and be able to balance out whether or not resources should be allocated to this or that in order to minimize scarcity. But we're seeing the direct maximization of scarcity zones within communities of color within the city. There's no reason why 5% of the land within the city contributes to the majority of violence. What this shows is that we have a lack of investment within these communities, and that these communities need to have some form of investment. What we're seeing is that these members of the communities are in survival mode and are forcing themselves to go down a road of perpetual trauma that perpetuates this wheel of violence. So what this means is that we have to get down to the fundamental issue of why gun violence is occurring and addressing the root causes. Another thing I would like to address is that we keep on talking about how we need to get guns off the street. Yes, we do need to do that, but attacking supply alone, as shown in economics, just increases the demand of that item. What this means is that we're negating fundamental principles of economics when looking at this issue, when in reality, gun violence in itself is an economical issue. It is an issue that contributes to conversations that look at how resources are allocated, how schools are being funded, and all those other things that intertwine with one another. All those things are related to economics, which correlates to a public health issue. All of these things are things that work inside in tandem, and we have to examine how our systems operate in order to truly deconstruct them and promote a future that leads to less gun violence. The next thing I would like to bring out is that we can't arrest ourselves out of this problem. It was great that law enforcement was in the room, and I wish they could stay for this part of the conversation, because when we lock up someone, we're just pushing that next person to the next state of desperation that's going to force them to commit those very same actions. What this means is that by the time we get into the law enforcement system, by the time we arrest them, we're already too late. Gun violence is what happens at the end of the pipeline as a result of governmental lapses and pitfalls. What this means is that we have to further examine our systems, particularly the education system. I believe it might have been a month ago, I released an article called Disarm Hate that particularly deconstructs and looks at how our systems operate. And it was a play on words because currently within the gun violence prevention movement, disarm hate is a term that's being used in order to stop hate crimes, when in reality, we have larger hate crimes happening across the country each and every day by systematic battering. And what it refers to is looking at numbers that happen inside of Illinois and looking at the age group of 17 up to 25 and also 17 up to 35, where you have people that have been engaging in gun violence, do not have a basic education in high school, don't have a GED, but yet are dying at the highest rates upon release. What this means is that our prison systems are inept when it comes down to preventing people from falling down the same exact pathways that led them there to the first place. Part of this is due in part of not having systems of accountability within our law enforcement, yes, but also not providing programs within our prison systems that can divert people down different pathways. Another thing is that within the city of Baltimore, we have well over 17,000 vacant homes. When you have dilapidated properties and you have properties that are not cared for, it sends a clear message that the community is not cared for. Therefore, people act out in that very same way. Right? When I was in the hallway, my colleague Antonio referred to how he can walk inside of one neighborhood and see how the sidewalk appears compared to another neighborhood that has people of higher socioeconomic value, but still live within the city of Baltimore. What this speaks is to the further disinvestment that has been caused by racist practices such as the Housing Act of 1934, such as other systemic practices that have caused this kind of divide and caused the economic disenfranchisement that has led to this form of violence. Upon my work and upon my further research, I have actually proposed and come up with a solution that will fix this divide by way of intensive community investment. It's a kind of a play on a solution called CEPTED, which stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. Instead of just going in, cleaning and greening spaces, we're also going to be allocating spaces towards something in the future, whether it be a multi-purpose center, whether it be a school, whether it be a grocery store. All these things are tapping into what causes gun violence. And a lot of these areas that are quote unquote scarcity zones or micro zones, you also see food apartheid runs rampant. So all these things are linking back to resource deficiency and scarcity. What this means is that we have to employ effective solutions that are able to do this. One thing I can also say is disheartening is that I'm only 20 years old. When I came up with the solution, I was 19 years old, but yet I received a lack of help when it comes down to other organizations that have been involved in this work for years due to the part of people working in silos, yes, but also fatigue. A lot of people in Baltimore are fatigued of this work, and I would urge those that are fatigued to step back and allow young people to take the charge. It's completely insane that we don't have young people that are actually leading bigger projects that it might be sanctioned by the city to fix this problem. The solution that I came up with is guaranteed to decrease gun violence by over 30%, a minimum of 30%, and it's mimicked after actions that have been done inside of Philadelphia as well as New York that have employed similar solutions. Just by improving lighting, they saw a decrease in gun violence and overall crime. What this means is that the comprehensive plan I put together called Be More Safe Zones will not just decrease gun violence, but decrease all forms of crime within the city by way of doing comprehensive investment. Right now, we're looking to do a 1-year pilot where we just do the cleaning and the greening, with culturally responsive art being there, planting trees, putting community gardens there, as well as restoring basic community norms so that residents don't act out on vengeance on one another, as well as bridge the divide between the police department and the community to begin with. What this means is that we're going to be doing work that's restorative in order to pretty much bring back that village so that gun violence is not persist within our communities. And yes, this work is tasking. Yes, this work is daunting, but I have had several individuals that are interested in this work. I've met with you privately on this work as well. I've also met with Daniel Webster, who's agreed to do the evaluation on this project. And this project is one that will be effective in saving lives and that needs to be mimicked all across the country. I've also have colleagues in Detroit that are asking me, hey, I know it might be taking a while to get it done in Baltimore. Can we do it in Detroit? Can we do it in Chicago? What this shows is that yes, this plan is one that will work and one that other people can get behind of, and it allows Baltimore to be a model city on how we need to correct this issue. Yes, this issue has persisted for a very long time, and yes, the work may be daunting, but it's that daunting work that causes the real change. In life, we're called to do the impossible, meaning that we're called to go ahead and destroy those institutions that have perpetuated systems of injustice and violence across our city. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Brian Turner.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Ryan Turner, Executive Director of Community Law and Action here in Baltimore, also known as CLEA. We work to provide positive opportunities where young people can create positive changes in Baltimore through public policy and advocacy. Ever since it happened, I stay up all night. I try to fall asleep, but I'm afraid that it'll happen again. Next time, I won't wake up. These are the words of a Baltimore City public school student in response to a bullet flying through her window in the middle of the night and missing her by only a few inches. As a result of a stray bullet flying through her window, this young lady now experiences insomnia, a sleep disorder that is characterized by difficulty falling or staying asleep. Not only does this student, by her own testimony, present with the physiological implications of insomnia, but her chronic fatigue has begun to impact her academic career. Once a student who received mostly B's, she is now categorically behind many of her classmates and is failing most of her classes. In addition to the physiological and academic implications, this student's interpersonal relationships have been impacted. She reports increased arguments at home stemming from episodic mood swings related to lack of sleep, altercations among her peers due to lack of trust and social anxieties among large crowds. On one night, one bullet went through one window, almost injuring and killing one young girl, and has dramatically impacted not just her, but many who are connected to her, and thus the wider community. In addition to providing this young lady with the support she needs to heal from this traumatic incident, who took a look at the root cause that caused the shooter to have the gun and use it in a haphazard manner in the first place? I submit to you today that gun violence is in fact a public health crisis, but not just a public health crisis. It is a public health crisis that lacks an equitable lens. By way of definition, according to the CDC Foundation, public health is the science of protecting and improving the health of people and their communities. Protection speaks of a preventative measure that is employed in order to preserve one's well-being. Improving refers to making necessary adjustments in order to make something better. I offer to you this evening that we find ourselves engaged in a discussion to substantiate gun violence as a public health issue because there is more emphasis placed on the perpetrator than on the people. There is more emphasis on preserving a prison industrial complex than there is to protect and improve the health of all people. Our reactive response to gun violence has been to arrest the perpetrator and then find a way to blame mental illness, call him troubled, and slap him on the wrist, or find all pictures of urban expression that can be found, plaster them on the news, anoint him with the title thug, and throw him under the jail. There is more focus placed on criminalizing, arresting, and throwing away the key than there is implementation of restorative practices, investment in low socioeconomic communities, equal access to health care, and funding for social programs that would prevent the manifestation of violent behaviors. If we truly saw gun violence as a public health issue and cared to do something about it, we would invest on the front end to significantly reduce and ultimately ameliorate the existence of gun violence. Protecting and improving health of people does not simply include having access to a doctor with a stethoscope. It means having access to a quality of life that statistically positions you for positive health outcomes, devoid of circumstances that produce emotional imbalances and cause you to exist in an environment where you feel the need to survive by the means of a handgun. Addressing gun violence as a public health issue means getting to the root of why people are shooting in the first place from a holistic perspective. According to the National Council on Family Relations, most urban areas, especially those that experience the most gun violence, are characterized by poverty, inequality, and racial segregation. Thankfully, the young lady who I referenced at the start of this testimony has started to receive the intense services that she requires in order to begin to heal from this traumatic experience. But what more, if anything, was done not to the shooter? Unfortunately, according to criminology reports, mandatory minimums, and zero-tolerance policies, I can tell you what supports were provided or not based on the hue of the shooter's skin. In order to change the narrative on gun violence and approach it from a public health perspective, we must take a holistic approach. We must be proactive in our response, restorative in our justice, and persistent in destroying structural racism. Finally, prioritizing gun violence as a public health crisis requires the examination and recommendation of a multitude, to include but not limited to social workers, therapists, doctors, nurses, community leaders, mediators, and of course, our children and youth.
Thank you. And I did have a couple questions, but we'll go to our last speaker, Ms. Tamika Walker.
Hello. Wait a minute.
Hey, how are you?
Hello, I'm Tamika Walker, the mother of Milton Carrington, who was gunned down on August the 29th on Monument Street. So I was asked to come here because I've been trying to get my son's story out all over. And when this initially happened to us, it was kind of like a lot of people repost this video of us being shot, but nobody could repost this video to get the help. Since this has happened to me, it's been 9 surgeries. There has been, oh wow. It's been a lot for my kids that you would think that they were present when we were gunned down. My 5-year-old son woke up, pottied himself, something he doesn't do, and was saying that a man was on our house step. I then got up to check, and there was no one on the step. And so he said, Mom, he climbed through the window. I said, well, where did he go? He's on the step. I said, well, what was he doing? He said, Ma, he was cocking the gun back, but the gun didn't have no bullets. So I'm like, okay, is this really happening, or is this in his mind? So I had to come to reality with myself that this is in his mind. This is all made up in his mind, but he's just that scared that Mom been shot 10 times trying to protect my brother, and my brother is dead. Since this has happened, we haven't had hardly no help. Just like Antonio pretty much said, you have the news reporters who come around, but what are they doing? As long as they can get a story, they get a check pretty much. It has been 2 months yesterday that my son's been gone. I haven't heard nothing from homicide detectives about anything in the case. A month after it happened, me and my children were sitting out front, and a white car came down the side of my home, because I live on a corner house, and he made his hand like gun fingers and rolled past and smiled at me. I then called my detective and told my detective, because I felt that that was a threat towards me or my children. Well, unfortunately, he told me he could not relocate me because he has to know that that is a threat coming from us being shot. So then I got on the phone and called my witness advocate. Well, the witness advocate also told me the same thing. It's nothing that they can do unless they have a suspect in custody. So then it's saying to me, you have to be shot again or actually be killed to get help. Well, we already went down that line of being shot and my son being killed. We still are in the same home, roughly 4 blocks from where we were shot at. I'm still there right now till this day. It's a lot, and a lot of people don't want to come forward because they feel no snitching. But see, this is where people get it wrong at. Before they made a video called Stop Snitching, everybody was snitching. But once this video came out that you couldn't snitch, it wasn't for people who work hard, live their life right, and do things on an everyday life basis. It was meant for the people who were out here committing the murders, out here holding the guns and the drugs. They were the ones who couldn't snitch. And so now you have it where as though it's nobody wants to come forward. But most of my pain comes from when I see ongoing murders happening, and it's like whoever is doing the reward money, it's like, well, we're gonna pick you, and you to give the reward money to, and we're gonna get your suspect. And everyone that I have seen get a reward for their loved ones have their suspects brought to justice. And so it bothers me because this was a quadruple shooting, as well as a murder, also caught on video. And it was like, no reward, nothing, no reward, no one's coming forward. Me not just knowing nothing, I'm in the dark until this day, still in the dark. And so I feel as though since this happened, I can't do but so much for my children, because they told me in the hospital I wasn't gonna walk for 6 to 12 months. Here I go, 2 months later, I'm walking. You know, and so a lot of things are hard for me right now, just because during that hospital stay, there were a lot of appointments to be attended to for benefits and recons and redebts and things like that, that all those things got shut down. It got to a point where when my son's funeral came about, do you take your bill money and pay your bills, or do you bury your child? I buried my child. But I have 7 other children, and now we have an eviction notice. But it's still like, where do the help and the support come from? I'm reaching my hand out, I'm asking for help, but there's no help. I have a 13-year-old son who's under my 16-year-old son who do not know how to control his emotions. And I'm in fear that he might just be next, because he do not know how to control his emotions from his brother being killed and his mom being shot 10 times. I looked around this room and it's just like so many people were here. Everybody's preaching about the gun violence, how we need to do this and how we need to do that. But it's like, okay, you talking, now you're gone. Why not listen to what everyone have to say and see how we all can come together to nip it in the bud? It's never gonna work when you have someone that wanna speak and get their point across and then leave. Well, then how do you know what the next person had to say? That might just be the ticket. You don't know. The cameras, it's just everyone going, it's us here. How does that work? It's not. It's never going to work like that. Never. And so I feel people probably been down here 5 and 6 times, pretty much about the same thing. But is there change? When will it be changed? How many more children have to die? How many more innocent people have to die before someone says, okay, we need to just go ahead and do this? The kids have nothing but time on their hands. My son was a squeegee kid. Milton was a squeegee boy. Milton ain't never sold drugs. Milton was an honor roll student. He did things with Mr. William. You know, my son was a leader in the community. But at that teenage age, my son used to always tell me, Ma, I don't want no money from you, Ma. He was so independent that he wanted to get out there and make his dollar by himself, but the honest way. But when you have people trying to pull those kids back from making that money, then you're pushing them to sell the drugs. And then selling drugs end up toking the guns. Toking the guns end up in jail for life or dead. So it's just a lot of things that I see that I don't understand, a lot of things that people say that I will never understand. But then I say, you have so many people that will talk about this and act like they're in fear, but never been through nothing, never maybe even seen a gun shot before. How can you be that terrified and never walk through it? And half of the people that probably are in this room probably live in the most quietest neighborhoods. Quiet. But when you have someone like myself who actually can not play a video, but can be right here in front of your face and say, I just went through it. I just was shot 10 times trying to protect my son. And the most saddest thing that 2 other children were shot, but nobody was speaking about them. They only spoke about me and my son. Altogether, there were 4 people shot that night. 4. But no one speaks about those other 2 kids, Kyrie and Doobie. That's not right. So how is it going to be changed when y'all not even speaking about everything that's happening? Y'all speaking about the main thing that's happening, a mom who was protecting her child who died. I don't know. Some things I'm just speechless about. Like I said, I didn't have the people come and say that they were going to get me in my kid's house, and hey, 2 months later, where are we at? We're still there. You know, my kids actually got put out of school today. This is what's crazy. As much as I have been through, I haven't had a moment to grieve in peace yet. My children got put out of school for safety reasons today. So it's so much that's going on, but it's just like, okay, well, where is the helping hand? Where is the helping hand at? You don't have a helping hand. You know, I ask my kids all the time, do y'all want to go to grievance counseling? No, we don't want to go to grievance counseling. Man, they talk to people like that all the time. You know, so I have family support, which is my mother, Antonio, you know, because a lot of my loved ones live out of town. But Will, you know, who really knew Milton. But it's just, where is the real support at, you know? And the reporter asked me, well, what do you want done about it? You know, your son is gone, you're shot. What would you like done? I told him I would really like revenge done. To be honest, I'm not gonna lie. That's my child. But why do I feel that he should go to jail and get a slap on the wrist and still get to get a visit? He still get to read pictures. He still get to eat. Why is there not a death penalty? You took a life. Legally, we're going to take your life. I feel as though if there was a death penalty law in Baltimore City, I think a lot of people would think twice before picking up a gun and saying, it's this easy for me to kill you. Because I know if I kill you and I get caught, I'm going to be killed too. Thank you for hearing my story. I really appreciate y'all. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. So I do want to note that this hearing is still being televised live, and it will be online. So while I'm also disappointed, this is for all y'all. Thank you for sticking out with me on this one. But yeah, you are not being heard. It is televised. We will be posting it. It's on YouTube. I mean, we're going to get the word out for this for sure. I share y'all frustration sometimes that, you know, a lot of people are really active on social media and in front of the cameras, but when it comes to having real conversations, solution-focused conversations, difficult conversations, and hearing the stories like you shared with us tonight, you know, people that's not what they're focused on, right? I can tell you I'm focused on moving this conversation forward into actual action, which is why we did it the way we've done it and brought the people in who are doing amazing work. So you have a commitment from me as the chair of this committee and a representative of, living in West Baltimore to follow through on what we've heard today. But again, I do want to thank y'all for speaking to me, at least, and the folks who were tuned in and taking the time for us. I do want to throw one last question out to all of you. You all don't all have to answer, but one of the things I've grappled with, and that's why I asked Mr. Moore in the beginning, is what does actual having a seat at the table in the decision-making process look like to you, and how can we do that in a better way than what we've done to date as a government official just asking that question, and as a representative asking that question, and you know, anybody want to jump in on it, but I just think, you know, we've heard a lot about what needs to be done, but I think the voices really need to have a legitimate seat at the table and decision-making process, and just want to know what that actually looks like to you.
Hello again, this is Joshua Turner. I believe that having a true seat at the table looks like allowing someone different to take charge, meaning not just relying on your publicly elected officials, but also allowing a young person to take charge on an issue in a particular section. One of the things that was mentioned earlier is how we all have to work together in tandem, and I believe that that's what's needed. We all need to work together in tandem and take on various different aspects of the work, as well as collaborate collectively on solutions that have both immediate impact, that have some kind of multidimensional impact when it comes down to short-term, long-term, and then even longer-term sustainability in the future to prevent violence from happening. I also believe that there also has to be some kind of allowance for different people to propose policy, different people to propose different ideas on legislation that can be effective on attacking this issue. It's obvious that yes, legislation is needed, because in order to make some kind of long-term sustainable change outside of just social change, you need legislation to change so that the parameters around our reality can change to prevent the disadvantages from occurring through systematic violence. And I honestly believe that that's what needs to happen, or for us to have a true seat at the table, that there has to be effectively more young people leading the charge. There has to be more young people sitting on these meetings, or even not an elected official serving on that serving on that very committee. There has to be someone young. There has to be someone that's willing to go ahead and drive that work to the next level with the public.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Lee Tree Scant, co-organizer for Baltimore Ceasefire. My answer to your question is to be centered in community and to bring people who are centered in community and people who don't have interests that don't serve the community. Politics is a very weird space because people have their own agendas that they want to push, and sometimes those agendas work opposite of the needs of community. And so we're not going to get out of this if we're always focused on business needs, political needs, and needs that don't, at the end of the day, serve community. I don't like the way that politics works. I understand it. And it's frustrating to know that a person can play to the emotions of their constituents and make promises that they know they have no intention on keeping, to get into office to do something completely opposite. Community right now does not know how to hold political officials accountable to their promises. And so we are in a very vulnerable position, because then we fight and argue with one another about why this thing isn't being done. You said you were going to do X, Y, Z, and then that political official can turn away from its people and execute the agenda that they had in the back of their mind the whole time. And that's a dangerous game that people play with other people's lives.
Thank you.
So I actually have Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, LBS. I actually have somewhat of a technical response to this question, but I think it's necessary. I actually want to start by saying that, as I mentioned before, and I actually didn't mention this during my testimony, like the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. So what a lot of people aren't familiar with is the fact that all laws that govern criminal justice policy and policing are state laws. And so as a result, even for, and I think it would be important to even mention that you all, even as elected officials, as members of the Baltimore City Council, there's a whole lot of information that you're not privy to, right, as a result of the fact that the LEOBR is structured in a way where, unless you're the police commissioner, right, you don't get access to certain kinds of information. And so I think a part of it is figuring out a way to build the political will such that we can make some substantive amendments to the LEOBR, particularly around external entities being able to be a part of or be privy to investigations, internal investigations. So for instance, when you think about internal affairs, right, all of that information is roped off from the public, right? And so there is no substantive access to that information. So I think that's one part of it. The other piece, as it relates to actual law enforcement and their role, because there are times when I think that in reaction to some of the deficiencies of law enforcement, that people then ask law enforcement to do a bunch of stuff that really shouldn't be in their job description, right? So there's a move towards like this notion of community police, and I think to a certain extent that's helpful, but police really should be the last resort. And so in saying that, a part of what's also necessary is thinking about what are some of the mechanisms by which community can ask specific questions about the status of certain homicide cases, for instance, right? And a part of the problem, and the, you know, the sister that testified a moment ago, I think is a great example of this deficiency, in the sense that you're not entitled to any information about the status of an investigation, right? About the nature of what happened, about, you know, what police are doing. And that's largely done as a result, as I've mentioned before, about the Fraternal Order of Police, the fact that they are a union that wields a tremendous amount of power. I would argue it's the reason why they're able to extract, at this point, $500 million out of the city's budget, and why they're able to execute on so much overtime in ways that other agencies aren't able to. And so I think there needs to be a piece around how to really undermine the FOP's ability to negotiate things in the collective bargaining contract that bar the ability for people to participate. I actually think the collective bargaining contract is an opportunity, if leveraged appropriately, to bake into the agreement certain kinds of mechanisms of accountability. An example of this actually in Montgomery County, because one of the things that we fought for in a few legislative sessions ago was around civilians on trial boards. So for us, that was a small step that was put into the collective bargaining contract. And so those boards are the boards where, if the commissioner dispenses discipline, the officer can amend for a trial board. And that trial board, now there's no prohibition on law enforcement being on those trial boards. We actually advocated that non-law enforcement community folks should be able to be on those trial boards and be a part of the determining the process of discipline, to which the FOP is militantly opposed to. And so, but the reason why I bring all that up is because in thinking about, what it would mean to bake into the collective bargaining contract certain provisions that would allow the public and all those who the council deems an important part of the process the ability to ask those kinds of questions of accountability. And again, I'll just reiterate the fact that with any other public good, the expectation is that the consumer would have a way to assess the effectiveness of that particular consumer good. This is one of the few contexts where, and it was actually ruled by the Supreme Court, there was the Shields case where there was a person who filed a complaint against an officer because an officer left a voicemail, didn't know that they were leaving a voicemail, using racial epithets against the person for whom was going to file this complaint. And the Court of Appeals in the state of Maryland found that that person was not entitled to know the outcome of the complaint that they levied against that officer, right? So I'm saying that's the level of protection that law enforcement has as it relates to external folks being able to be a part of that process. So again, I would explore the potential of using the collective bargaining process with the FOP to embed, and I would maybe solicit from the community, what should those mechanisms be for community to be involved in being able to hold law enforcement accountable so that people can expect the kind of information needed to hold them accountable.
Thank you.
Ryan Turner, Executive Director, Community Law in Action. This might sound a little esoteric, if you will, but some time ago I heard the CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, Sonia Santalisa, say that it's important that we respect everybody's smart. And I think that in terms of what we're talking about today, respecting everybody's smart means that the folks that we sit around tables talking about, that we invite them to the table and had to have leadership, actual leadership roles in order to make these kinds of changes, not using folks' stories to capitalize and sensationalize and, just kind of using them for the stories that they have, but really allowing folks who have been impacted by gun violence and folks who are within our communities opportunities to really make decisions, because it's our community folks who have the answers. We can sit around and we can theorize and we can pontificate all we want to, but it is not until we allow everybody a seat at the table to really begin to make some long-term changes in our city.
Thank you. Go ahead, Brad.
I wanted to take a second to bring another community member to the table. We couldn't be here physically in person, but I wanted him to have a chance to speak his piece as well. A short introduction, Terry Williams is someone that has run the Challenge to Change program in East Baltimore. My neighborhood has been pivotal in housing some of the great work I've been doing, but also in stopping a lot of the crime that could have been happening in our neighborhoods. With a focused deterrence model around high-risk young people, educational restorative justice, conflict resolution, personal and manhood development. Uncle T has stepped up to become the change we need to see in McElderry Park. But I want to take a second to give him a call. Should be calling back shortly.
Okay, so what I want to do is we're going to recess. If you would like, we should wrap after this because I want to bring this group back together. Because I don't want to hold everybody up waiting on the call, but we're not going to conclude this hearing. We're going to recess it and continue the conversation. So let's wrap and make sure we get him here the next time. Is that cool? Okay. All right. So with that, the hearing is recessed. Again, I want to thank all of you for taking your time and expertise and sharing it with the committee. And I look forward, I mean, obviously I'm working with a number of you in a bunch of capacities already anyway, so we're going to keep that work going, but make sure you have all of your belongings, and we will absolutely be in touch to follow up on what the next steps are going to be for this. So thank you.